Hey guys, tonight we're wandering into the foggy maze of Victorian London, where sleep was anything but simple. You pull your scarf tighter against the soot-smudged wind, your boots slick with grime, as gas lamps flicker dimly above cobbled streets. A chimney belches out smoke like it's got something to say, and someone's arguing with a cat 3 doors down. Welcome to the night. It's cold. It's noisy. And you're exhausted. But if you think this city's going to let you rest, you probably won't survive this. The air smells like a mix of horse, coal, and whatever that thing was you just stepped in. You shiver, but not just from the chill. It's that creeping awareness that you're about to fall asleep in the most restless place on earth. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking down a street that doesn't really end, just fades into the gray. Fog clings to your coat like a toddler with separation anxiety. You pass a grocer, shuttered for the night, its stale bread smelling faintly of mold. A cart creaks slowly by, driven by a man with no nose to speak of. He hums something tuneless. You hum it too, without knowing why. Sleep in Victorian London doesn't start with warm baths and lavender mist. It starts with a city that forgets how to shut up. The sound of hooves on cobbles, the hiss of gaslight mantles, the tick of clocks behind thin walls, you're never alone with your insomnia. It's communal, somehow. A shared burden of exhausted, twitching Londoners all pretending this place sleeps. It doesn't. Not really. The fog is thick, yes, but it's not the romantic, Sherlock Holmes kind. It's yellow, claggy, a stew of coal smoke and damp. They called it a pea souper, though you wouldn't want to eat it. Your lungs ache a little with each breath, and historians still argue whether the infamous 19th century fogs were more deadly or merely more visible. You'd probably lean toward deadly, but who's asking? You pause at a corner where a lamplighter just finished his round. His ladder left a small dent in the wet ground, and the lamp above you gives off a soft sigh. Not a light. A sigh. The kind of sound a flame makes when it's too tired to burn properly. Some nights, the lamps hiss louder than the people do. As you move deeper into the neighborhood, the houses tilt inward. These aren't elegant townhouses. These are close-set, soot-streaked shells packed with families, boarders, and the occasional rat family you probably shouldn't name. You can hear a baby crying behind one wall, the rhythmic squeak of a bedspring behind another. It's like a live-in radio station broadcasting stress and sleeplessness on all frequencies. There's a mattress in one window, just a single one, no frame, propped half up against the sill for air. Or fleas. You try not to wonder which. You think about the luxury of quiet. Of darkness. Of clean sheets. But those are rare treasures here. Victorian London was a place of invention, sure, but not necessarily for comfort. Most innovations helped people survive, not sleep. And while the Industrial Revolution brought railways, factories, and empire, it also brought noise, gas leaks, and an unhealthy obsession with moral restlessness. No, really. Some people believed insomnia was a virtue. A sign of spiritual distress. The anxious were often praised for their sleeplessness, seen as pious souls too burdened with divine thoughts to waste time on unconsciousness. You, meanwhile, are mostly thinking about toast. Preferably in milk. But we'll get to that. A coach rumbles by, its lanterns swinging like drunken fireflies. Inside, a lady snoozes with her mouth open. Her hat is slipping off, and so is her dignity. You envy her. Even a catnap counts when you live in a city where the clocks never agree and every alley's a wind tunnel. A shadow moves near the alley mouth, followed by a muffled sneeze. You keep walking. It's worth noting, because historians do, often with unnecessarily long footnotes, that the very structure of Victorian nights was different. Many people followed what's now called segmented sleep. You'd go to bed early, wake in the middle of the night to read or talk or pray or, I don't know, inspect your feet, and then go back to bed for a second sleep. The industrial clock would eventually squash this rhythm, but back then, it was common. Two-part nights. Half dreams. Lingering candlelight. Weirdly romantic. Sure. Also deeply inconvenient when your walls are made of paper and your neighbors got bronchitis. You pass an open window. Inside, a family sits at a wooden table. The father is telling a story, his hands moving more than his mouth. The mother sips something from a chipped mug. The kids yawn in sequence, like it's choreographed. And behind them, on the stove, a small pot steams gently. Maybe it's broth. Maybe it's milk. Maybe it's something sleepier. You reach your lodging house. A narrow building with stairs that scream in Morse code. Your room is on the 3rd floor, and no one's turned the bedding since Tuesday. You light a candle, not trusting the gas, and take off your boots. The room smells faintly of coal, lavender sachet, and whatever the last tenant left behind. Probably regrets. You sit on the edge of the bed and look out the window. The fog's thick again. Somewhere below, someone's playing a violin badly. Very badly. You imagine them dreaming with their eyes open, just like you. This is where your night begins, not in peace, but in persistence. You'll chase sleep the way Londoners did, in layers, in scraps, in smells, in silence that's never quite silent. And as your eyes start to close, maybe, just maybe, you'll find yourself dreaming of toast. You lie back, boots off, one sock mysteriously missing, listening to the city hum and grumble around you. Sleep doesn't arrive like a friendly visitor here, it slinks in grudgingly, like a cat that hates being picked up. The mattress beneath you is lumpy in several key places, one spring poking up like it's trying to audition for a fencing tournament. But you're used to discomfort by now. Everyone is. In Victorian London, sleep was less a nightly retreat and more an ongoing negotiation, with the environment, your nerves, and sometimes your digestion. Insomnia wasn't rare. It was practically expected. This was a coal-fed city that didn't believe in silence or fresh air. Chimneys coughed around the clock. Coal dust didn't so much settle as settle in, into your curtains, your pores, your lungs. Even your dreams sometimes smelled like soot. You wake up feeling like you've been sleeping inside a fireplace. And the noise. Oh, the noise. London's nights were not peaceful. Carts rattled across cobblestones long after midnight. Public houses let out rounds of drunken singing that started cheerful and ended philosophical. Occasionally, someone would bellow a folk ballad about a drowned sailor or a dishonest pie-maker. It really set the mood. Even the upper crust, those mythical folks with servant-plumped featherbeds and curtains so thick they could muffle a cannon, weren't always better off. Their sleeplessness came from worry. Investments. Affairs. Whether the Queen looks stern enough this week. One popular journal from 1874 includes a confession: I have not known a full night's rest in over 4 years, owing chiefly to the ongoing disturbances of our dog and my wife's misgivings about gypsies. Not quite Shakespeare, but it gets the point across. You try to steady your breathing, counting backwards, but your mind won't shut up. That's another Victorian concern, mental overactivity. One doctor claimed it was the leading cause of insomnia. Not poor diet. Not the air, which sometimes had the consistency of treacle. Not the overuse of opium. No, it was thinking too much. Daydreaming when you should be night dreaming. It's the kind of diagnosis that feels oddly modern. Lie awake for long enough, and your thoughts start to feel like an obnoxious guest rummaging through your brain's junk drawer. And then there's the cold. The dampness. London never really dries, not fully. Even in summer, a draft seems to sneak under every door, up every sleeve, into every shoe. The poor suffered the most, of course. Single-room lodgings, sometimes windowless, with barely space for a bedroll. Several people to a bed. Occasionally more. Sometimes you didn't even get a bed, you'd pay for space on a rope stretched across a room, hanging there like laundry, leaning forward until you nodded off. Called a penny hang, it was the cheapest sleep money could buy. Also guaranteed a crick in the neck so aggressive it could file a grievance. Historians still argue whether the rope sleeping method was humane improvisation or capitalist cruelty. Probably both. A Victorian specialty. Back in your own room, you hear a sudden rush of coughing through the wall. Not polite little throat clearings. Full-bodied, rib-jangling spasms. Could be bronchitis. Could be a factory worker. Could be the man 2 doors down who insists on shouting about carrots at 3 a.m. You pull your blanket higher, not that it helps. It's mostly threadbare. Feels more psychological than physical at this point. Sometimes, you think, maybe this city wants you to stay awake. Maybe it needs witnesses. Let's talk about the beds themselves. Not every home could afford one, and even among those that could, comfort wasn't guaranteed. Cheap mattresses were often filled with straw or flock, a polite term for scraps of textile waste. Better off homes might have horsehair, which sounds dignified but scratches like it's holding a grudge. The elite had featherbeds, sure. But feathers compress. And shift. You ever slept on a bird that migrated in the night? Exactly. Pillows weren't much better. Some were filled with seeds or grain husks. Others stuffed with cotton batting, sometimes repurposed from old dresses or curtains. Which sounds charming until you realize the last person to sleep on that pillow had lice and a suspicious rash. Bedding cleanliness, of course, was an uphill battle. You didn't just have to worry about body odor. You had to worry about bedbugs, fleas, and occasional uninvited mice. There are reports of families banging on mattresses with sticks before lying down, partly to fluff them up, partly to chase out whatever else had taken up residence. You lie very, very still for a moment, as if that alone will prevent infestations. Smart. And then there's the temperature problem. Victorian homes were terrible at regulating heat. Poor insulation, drafty chimneys, and an almost religious avoidance of closing windows, even in winter. Doctors kept insisting fresh air cured everything from gout to heartbreak. So you froze at night. For your health. To cope, people layered up. You didn't wear pajamas so much as armor. Long flannel nightshirts, woolen socks, sometimes even a cap, yes, like Ebenezer Scrooge. He wasn't being quaint. He was trying not to die of frostbite between dreams. Still can't sleep. Neither could half the city. That's why night walks were a thing. Not because people were poetic. Because people were bored, or cold, or anxious. They'd pace the foggy streets, hands in coat pockets, hoping motion would calm the mind. Writers like Dickens did it constantly. Of course, he claimed he was gathering material. Maybe. Or maybe he just had a lumpy mattress and a brain that wouldn't shut up. Some walked to avoid their homes altogether. Domestic life wasn't always peaceful. Arguments, debts, illness, or just sheer overcrowding meant that nighttime sometimes felt more survivable outside than in. There's a quiet tragedy to that. But also a strange camaraderie. Londoners out at night weren't always up to no good. Some just wanted a break from the insomnia of being alive. You sit up again. Maybe some water. Maybe a stare out the window. The fog's still there, swirling like it has business to attend to. You wonder how many others are looking out at the same view, wondering the same thing, will I sleep tonight? You might. Eventually. But not just yet. You're standing now, barefoot on cold floorboards, flinching as your heel lands squarely on a nail head. Not sharp enough to draw blood, just enough to remind you that Victorian sleep never came softly. You shuffled toward the window again, candle in hand, wax dripping onto your wrist like a lazy spider. Outside, the street is quieter, but not quiet. Never quiet. There's a shuffling sound, like someone dragging a rug. Or a body. Probably a rug. You lean against the sill, breath fogging the pain. The chill seeps into your ribs. You think, absurdly, that you trade your last biscuit for a cup of warm milk. Or maybe something more, historic. Sleep aids, after all, weren't always as innocent as herbal tea or meditative breathing. No, in Victorian London, people reached for remedies that teetered between homey comfort and mild poison. Let's begin with the star of tonight's peculiar menu, toast soaked in milk. Yes. Actual toast. In actual milk. Warmed, preferably. A soggy, milky square of starch so flavorless, it apparently lulled the anxious to sleep through sheer culinary apathy. It was comfort food for people who had very little comfort. And toast was easy, cheap, adaptable, and oddly reliable. Soaked in milk, it became both a meal and a sedative. Not a strong one, mind you. But when your stomach's not churning, your thoughts sometimes stop spinning. That was the theory, anyway. Some even added nutmeg, believed to have mild calming properties. Others went fancier, steeping the toast with cinnamon or ginger, or pairing it with a spoonful of jam so the whole thing didn't taste like loneliness. Historians still argue whether the toast in milk habit was a folk remedy passed down through generations or a product of medical advice masquerading as kitchen wisdom. Either way, you wouldn't find it in a fine dining guide, but in a working-class home, it was practically prescription strength. You move away from the window and toward the rickety dresser, imagining the mothers who prepared such soggy concoctions for their fretful children, and for themselves. Picture it, a dim kitchen, a crackling fire, milk warming in a blackened pot, bread charring slightly because no one's watching it closely enough. A wooden spoon clinking against a tin mug. The sigh of someone who hopes this will help. Just this once. But toast wasn't the only edible sleep drug on offer. Far from it. Victorian sleep culture had a full pantry of bizarre and, let's say, questionable, remedies. Take lettuce water. Boiled lettuce leaves, steeped until the water turned a sad shade of green-gray, then served lukewarm. It was thought to calm the nerves and lull the body. And you know what? It might have helped. Lettuce contains small amounts of lacticarium, a milky fluid that mimics the effects of mild sedatives. You'd have to drink a lot of it to feel anything substantial, but hey, placebo is powerful. Another classic. Poppy syrup. Derived from the opium poppy, sweetened to be palatable, and sometimes mixed into children's nighttime drinks. Did it help them sleep? Absolutely. Was it safe? No. No, it was not. But few questioned it back then. If it worked, it was good enough. Especially when you hadn't slept in 3 nights and the baby wouldn't stop wailing about existential dread or sore gums. Still can't nod off. Don't worry. There's more. You might also try a bit of laudanum. A heady tincture of opium and alcohol, doled out like cough syrup. One of the most common household remedies, it was sold over the counter at apothecaries, cheaper than brandy and far more potent. Laudanum was the Ambien of the Victorian world, if Ambien came in a brown bottle labeled with a skull and the promise of both dreams and dependency. Writers loved it. Poets adored it. Doctors prescribed it like candy. And many a sleepless Londoner drifted into unconsciousness with a laudanum-laced nightcap in hand. It didn't cure insomnia, of course. It just muffled it. Drowned it in a haze. But sometimes that was enough. You sit back down on the bed, imagining the tiny vials and dropper bottles cluttering nightstands across the city. Everything from chloral hydrate to valerian root, each promising peace in a world that refused to shut up. The irony is almost sweet. And let's not forget alcohol. Good, old-fashioned drink. Gin was the go-to for many, especially among the poorer classes. Mother's ruin, they called it. You might nurse a pint of gin before bed, hoping it would knock you out quickly enough to avoid the part where your mattress squeaked and your neighbors snored like a haunted trombone. And if you were lucky, you'd sleep through till morning. If not, you'd wake up confused, dehydrated, and still inside your corset. Even respectable households embraced the nightcap tradition. Sherry, port, or hot toddies were as much a part of bedtime ritual as brushing your teeth. Not that people did much of that. Victorians were still figuring out dental hygiene, and frankly, sleep usually outranked oral care in the hierarchy of needs. Still, there were gentler options too. Herbal sachets tucked beneath pillows, filled with lavender, chamomile, or hops. A warm stone wrapped in cloth, placed at the foot of the bed. Old women would rub your temples with peppermint oil or mutter a charm while tying string around your wrist. Did it work? Maybe. Maybe not. But it gave people something to do. Something to hope for. You glance around your room again. Imagine the quiet clink of a mug on wood, the scrape of a spoon, the glow of embers in the fireplace as someone sits by the hearth, watching milk bubble and foam. A ritual. A routine. The city outside may be loud and filthy and stubborn, but in here, in this moment, someone is trying to create calm. Maybe that's the real sleep aid. The act of trying. Of believing in small comforts, no matter how soggy or strange. You lie back again, the lumpy pillow beneath your head cradling you like a reluctant uncle. Your eyes flutter closed for a second, then reopen. Still awake. But not quite restless. Not anymore. Toast and milk. Lettuce water. Opium and hope. London never truly sleeps. But sometimes, it dreams. The candle flickers on its last stub of wax, casting jumpy shadows across the room. They stretch like gossiping silhouettes on the walls, long-nosed and whispering. You blink slowly, still riding the warmth of imaginary toast milk, though you haven't eaten anything. And yet, that phantom comfort lingers. Odd how the mind will latch onto the idea of warmth and turn it into something nearly real. You're starting to see how someone might become obsessed with bedtime rituals in a place like this. The city is too loud, the bed's too stiff, the thoughts too loud. So you do whatever you can. Repeat little routines. Invent a pattern. Even if it's nonsense. Even if it's just brushing crumbs off your blanket 3 times or humming a half-remembered hymn under your breath. Victorian Londoners were professionals at this sort of thing. Not because it worked every time, but because something had to. And there were many such rituals. One of the simplest. Washing your feet. Just that. A small basin, tepid water, rough cloth. You'd sit on the edge of your creaky bed, trailing your toes in the chill and pretending it was refreshing, not a mild punishment. It wasn't just about cleanliness, it was believed to draw blood away from your overactive brain, like rerouting traffic from a roundabout. A calmer head through colder toes. Historians still argue whether this foot-washing habit was born from folk medicine or came from earlier monastic traditions. Either way, by 1850, it was common enough to find in etiquette books and doctors' guides alike. Cool the feet to ease the brain, said one pamphlet, as though sleep were a plumbing issue. You think briefly of all the cracked, soot-blackened feet dangling from iron bedsteads across the city. Drenched in water. Dried on threadbare towels. And still unable to carry their owners into dreams. Then there were the charms. You know, the little objects people kept tucked under pillows or in dresser drawers, not quite willing to believe in them, but not ready to go without. A coin blessed by a vicar. A scrap of ribbon soaked in rosewater. Even a single chicken feather, kept for luck. One midwife claimed that sleeping with a key under your pillow would lock away troubled thoughts. Another swore by tucking rosemary sprigs into your sleeves, aromatic armor against nightmares. Some went further. Superstition blended with strategy. Sleeping with your head pointed north. Keeping a slice of raw onion at the bedside to absorb night vapors. Drawing a chalk circle under the bed to trap restless spirits, or possibly just mice. And there was, of course, the classic, a Bible open to the book of Psalms, resting beside the bed. Not for reading, just for presence. Like holy insurance. You didn't have to understand the text, just believe it might keep away whatever invisible thing kept tapping at your sleep. You can't help smiling at that. Human beings, after all, are brilliant at assigning meaning to objects. And when the night stretches out endlessly and your body refuses to soften into sleep, it makes sense to turn to whatever's nearby. A feather. A verse. A ritual. Some folks believed in what today we'd call sleep position theory. You had to sleep on your left side. Or maybe you're right. One medical writer in 1863 swore that sleeping on your back caused nightmares, and not just any nightmares, he added, but those involving visitation by devils or criminal thoughts. How oddly specific. The Victorians didn't take those nightmares lightly. A bad dream could be an omen, a moral failing, or a result of indigestion. Sometimes all three. You were encouraged to reflect upon your thoughts before bed, confess them in prayer, and eat nothing after sundown, unless, of course, it was toast soaked in milk, which somehow didn't count. You shift your body slightly, noting the way the mattress gives beneath your hip. You wonder if you're facing the right direction. The window is east, so maybe your head is north. Or is it northeast? You sigh. Maybe this is why no one's asleep. Everyone's too busy wondering which side the devil enters from. Then there's the clothing. Victorian sleepwear wasn't exactly sensual. It was functional. Long, flannel gowns with stiff collars and mismatched buttons. Women sometimes wore corsets to bed, loosened but not removed, because shaping the body was a 24-hour concern. Men wore nightshirts and caps, partly for warmth, partly for dignity. You couldn't just tumble into bed in your work clothes unless you were too poor or too exhausted to care. Some families even had designated nighttime drawers, a literal chest of garments meant only for sleeping. Slippers, robes, capes. Because heaven forbid you be seen without a dressing gown if the house caught fire. Respectability first, third-degree burns second. You let your gaze drift to the floorboards again. Imagine the nightly routine in some crowded household above a fishmonger's stall. Children arguing over whose turn it is to wash. Someone groaning as they kneel beside the hearth to warm a stone. A grandmother murmuring a rhyme to ward off toothaches. The father placing a clay jug of boiled water under the sheets. The mother checking the latch twice, 3 times, 4, because the lock never quite sits right. Everyone trying their best. Everyone pretending that maybe tonight will be different. The truth is, sleep wasn't just personal in Victorian London. It was social. You shared beds. You shared rooms. You shared stories of dreams and nightmares. In some homes, sleep became a sort of community event, something to be worked toward together. Even if it meant passing around the last few spoonfuls of poppy syrup or reciting a charm in shaky voices. A girl might ask her sister to braid her hair in a particular pattern, so the fairies won't snatch me from my pillow. A boy might tuck his shoes under the bed toe first to walk into the dream world the right way. Silly. Maybe. But again, sleep was something to prepare for, like a journey. You lie back down. Pull the thin blanket up to your chin. The draft still sneaks through, but it feels a little less rude this time. Maybe you'll try sleeping on your side. Maybe you'll pretend the cracked ceiling above you is a star chart. Maybe you'll keep your shoes pointed north and think good thoughts. Not every charm works. But some do. You turn onto your side and immediately feel the sharp edge of a loose spring prod your hip. This mattress has clearly been through things: wars, floods, awkward first kisses. You shift again, trying to find a neutral zone. And in that movement, you feel it, the strangeness of shared space. Because in Victorian London, you almost never slept alone. Not for warmth, not for comfort, not even for affection. Just, out of necessity. You shared beds because there weren't enough to go around, and rooms because the rent was 2 shillings more than you had. Entire families would pile into a single mattress, like laundry left too long in a basket. Parents, children, sometimes boarders or cousins visiting for a night that stretched into a month. Elbows collided. Feet tangled. Someone always snored. And still, somehow, you slept. Or at least, you practiced being still with your eyes closed. The term bedfellow meant something different then. It didn't imply romance, it meant proximity. You could end up sharing a bed with a friend, a coworker, even a near stranger if accommodations were scarce. In boarding houses, this was standard. You'd pay for half a bed like it was a theater ticket, no refunds, no questions asked. Historians still argue whether this intimacy created deeper social bonds or just made everyone marginally more irritable. Likely both. It's hard to feel romantic when someone's cold feet are wedged behind your knees and you can smell their dinner breath even after they turn away. You reach toward the edge of the bed now, half expecting another body to be there. Just out of habit. Just a shadowy lump, breathing softly, muttering a dream. But the space is empty. Just lumpy blankets and the smell of old wood. Still, you can imagine it. Imagine the little arguments that broke out over bed territory. Who took up more space? Who hogged the blankets? Who mumbled in their sleep or kicked like a startled mule? Imagine the quiet, accidental intimacies, hearing someone's heartbeat through layers of flannel, or the way a child unconsciously reaches for a parent's hand mid-dream. Sometimes, you'd share with someone who couldn't afford to sleep elsewhere. The unofficial charity of a room, you can have the left side. And there they'd lie, clutching their belongings like a second skin. Both of you pretending this wasn't awkward. Both pretending this was just how things worked, which, in fact, it was. In workhouses, the arrangements were worse. Cramped rows of cots. No privacy, no softness, no choice. Sleep was a regulated privilege, doled out in strict schedules and narrow spaces. You didn't tuck yourself in, you laid down like a laborer taking orders. One old reformer described the scene as a dormitory of the damned, wherein breath and sorrow mixed nightly. But still, people slept. Or tried to. Meanwhile, in more modest homes, you might sleep head to foot to save space, or to minimize the risk of spreading illness. A sort of human yin-yang, with someone's toes near your ears and no one entirely sure whose socks belonged to whom. The wealthier classes fared better. Separate bedrooms, feather mattresses, and actual silence if you were lucky. But even then, married couples often slept in separate beds, an arrangement meant to preserve health, dignity, and the illusion of refined modesty. The idea of a single marital bed didn't become a mainstream ideal until the 20th century. Before that, you had your bed, they had theirs, and between you lay a nightstand full of tissues and polite distance. The Victorians were big on boundaries. Until they weren't. And then there were those who slept alone by necessity, not choice. Widows. Servants in attic rooms. Street urchins curled up beside bakery vents. The lone sleeper in a city of noise was a rare and often tragic figure. Even now, with your blanket pulled tight and the room mostly still, you feel the hollowness of empty space. One side of the mattress cold, unclaimed. The silence grows teeth. You imagine the servant girl upstairs, one floor above you, folding herself into the tiny gap between wall and trunk. Her bed is a pile of rags. She has her own charms, an old doll's shoe, a string of blue beads. She can't afford warm milk or lavender sachets, but she hums softly, something wordless and inherited. It won't bring her dreams, but it'll keep her calm. For now. In wealthier homes, servants' quarters were often tiny, windowless, and freezing. The beds were thin straw mattresses, if they existed at all. Yet even in those dark corners of the house, bedtime came with its own rituals. A final sweep of the hearth. A whispered curse against the master's muddy boots. A pocketful of crumbs stolen from dinner, to be eaten in secret before sleep. And those crumbs mattered. Food was memory. Even a dry crust could carry the comfort of routine. You can picture it clearly now, a dozen different beds in a dozen corners of the city. Straw ticking, horsehair mattresses, piles of worn quilts stitched with the ghosts of older fabrics. One girl wraps her scarf around her face to block the chill. A boy curls beneath a borrowed coat. Somewhere, an old man lies in a wooden drawer, literally, a coffin-maker's apprentice using unsold wares as bedding. You shift again, grateful for your lumpy mattress, even if it moans when you breathe too hard. Compared to most, you're royalty. Then there's the practice of sleep breaking. It's not just a 21st century sleep hack. Many Victorians observed a segmented sleep pattern, known now as biphasic sleep. They'd drift off for 4 hours or so after sunset, wake around midnight, then stay up for an hour or two before heading back to bed until dawn. They might read, pray, mend clothes, even visit neighbors during this middle-of-the-night liminal hour. Historians still argue whether this was intentional or simply the consequence of gaslighting schedules and natural circadian rhythms. Either way, people expected to wake up halfway through the night, and didn't panic about it. It was normal. A time for quiet thought, candlelight pacing, or hushed conversations in shared beds. You glance toward your candle, it's nearly out, trembling like a tired eye. If you wake again later, maybe you'll light it. Maybe you won't. You pull the blanket tighter. The beds of Victorian London were crowded, creaky, and inconsistent. But they held more than just bodies. They held rituals, worries, crumbs, songs. They held people together, often quite literally. And in a world that refused to be quiet, sometimes that closeness was the only thing that felt like sleep. The candle finally gives in with a gentle sputter, leaving you in a velvet hush broken only by the distant creak of floorboards, or is that your imagination, conjuring the groans of an old tenement? You're not sure. Either way, welcome to the hour of ghosts and digestion, two forces that Victorian Londoners believed worked closely together. Because yes, your belly, as it turns out, was the villain in many a sleepless night. Or so the era's experts claimed. Forget stress, heartbreak, or existential dread. The problem, they insisted, was your liver. Or your stomach. Or some delicate organ lurking in the midsection that couldn't quite behave itself after a heavy supper. Doctors, real and self-appointed, were all over this. They recommended gentle meals in the evening, taken at the same hour every day. A light gruel. A piece of fish. A carefully rationed serving of pudding, if you were lucky. You didn't just eat for nourishment, you ate for dreams. Historians still argue whether these dietary prescriptions actually worked or were simply ways of enforcing middle-class discipline. But one thing's for sure, people took their bedtime menus seriously. Take, for instance, the widely accepted idea that cheese before bed caused nightmares. You probably know that one. But the Victorians took it even further. Cheddar dreams were considered particularly chaotic, while Stilton might invite portents and spirits, according to one 1870s housewife's journal. It wasn't just food, it was psychic fuel. And let's talk about milk again, because the Victorians certainly did. Warmed, spiced, diluted, enriched. It was the great soother, the gentle white tide that was supposed to wash away your cares. It wasn't just for children. Grown men, bearded, brooding men, were known to cradle mugs of milk in the dead of night, hoping its bland embrace would dull the edge of too many thoughts. Sometimes it was just milk. Sometimes, toast joined the party, broken into bits and soaked till soggy, transforming into a kind of edible sponge. Other times, they added cinnamon, nutmeg, or a touch of sugar if they had it. This wasn't indulgence. This was sleepy time science. And if you're picturing it, yes, it was often eaten in bed. Bowls tucked carefully under blankets. Crumbs everywhere. That smell of warm dairy lingering long after the lights went out. Imagine trying to drift off while dodging soggy toast crumbs lodged near your ankles. You'd think they'd invent plates with little crumb walls. But no. Toast and milk was eaten as is, an act of faith in your own coordination. The ritual of it mattered. Preparing the snack, waiting for it to cool just enough, spooning it slowly, letting your eyes grow heavy. For some, this was the lullaby. Of course, not everyone was lucky enough to have food at bedtime. For many in the city, the last bite of the day happened at dusk, if at all. But for those with the means or the resourcefulness, there were entire traditions around bedtime food. One popular Victorian remedy for insomnia was posset, a hot drink made of milk curdled with ale or wine, then spiced and sweetened into submission. Think of it as the mulled wine of bedtime, though your digestive tract might not agree. A properly made posset was thick, creamy, and just alcoholic enough to blur the edges of your worries. Then came barley water, beef tea, and the infamous, slippery elm drink, which sounds more like something you'd scrape off a boot than sip before bed. It was made from elm bark powder stirred into warm water, a mucilaginous, bland concoction meant to line your stomach like a protective fog. And then there was lettuce water. Yes, lettuce. Boiled, strained, and sipped. Based on the belief that lettuce had natural sedative properties. It tasted exactly how you think boiled lettuce would taste. But people drank it. Repeatedly. Willingly. Desperately. You can't help but picture some exhausted clerk, lying flat on his straw mattress, cradling a chipped mug of barely warm lettuce water and muttering, "Please work." And sometimes, just believing in the ritual was enough. There's a kind of poetry in these strange little brews and snacks. Each one a tiny act of self-care in a brutal city. You weren't just feeding your body, you were feeding hope. The hope that maybe, just maybe, your stomach would hush, your mind would stop racing, and your eyes would finally close. You roll onto your back, imagining the smell of beef tea in the air. Salty, metallic, oddly comforting. It was often recommended to invalids and insomniacs alike. Rich in protein. Thin enough to sip in the dark. Some swore by it. But not all remedies were so savory. One infamous Victorian concoction, sometimes taken just before sleep, was syrup of poppies, essentially laudanum or opium diluted in sugar. You weren't supposed to become dependent, of course. But that didn't stop people from sneaking a drop or two into the warm milk when nothing else worked. Or everything else hurt. Even children were given syrup of poppies, sold over the counter in apothecaries with pleasant-sounding names like Mother Bailey's Quiet Night Elixir, or Dr. Temple's Soothing Syrup. Never mind the narcotic effects. The important thing was silence. Stillness. A house where no one cried out in the night. Historians still argue whether these remedies were more harmful than helpful, but for many Victorians, the line between medicine and mercy was blurry at best. You imagine the quiet hush of a bedroom after a dose. A mother easing into her own sleep, finally. A child drifting off under the influence of something sweet and smoky. It's easy to judge from here, but harder to ignore the desperation that drove such choices. You breathe in. Deep. Slowly. You're not hungry, but you understand the urge. A little bowl of something warm. A drink that promises peace. Not a full meal. Just enough. Enough to hush the ghosts in your gut. To make you feel like your body isn't working against you for once. Sleep, after all, isn't just about shutting off your brain. It's about convincing the rest of you to stop fighting the day. And in the gaslit gloom of Victorian London, that battle often ended in a spoonful of soggy toast. You reach over to where your nightstand should be, but remember, in this room, there isn't one. Just the floor, uneven and cold. Somewhere down there might be a cracked mug or a bitten biscuit from earlier, but that's not what you're after. You're reaching, instinctively, for something to ease the air, a smell, a flicker, a distraction. Because, as the Victorians understood all too well, sleep wasn't just physical, it was psychological warfare. And scent. That was one of their oldest weapons. Let's start with lavender. Sweet, purple, and deceptively powerful, this plant was more than a garden ornament, it was a sedative staple. Victorians tucked lavender into everything. Linen drawers. Pillowcases. Sachets sewn into nightgowns. If it had a pocket, they'd find a way to stuff a bit of lavender inside. The belief was simple, lavender calmed the nerves. And, let's be honest, life in Victorian London offered nerves aplenty. From factory bells at dawn to funeral carts rattling through cobblestone alleys, serenity wasn't exactly the city's default setting. Historians still argue whether the true calming effect came from lavender itself or the ritual of preparing it. Did the scent soothe the brain, or did the act of folding it into a pillow signal your body that it was time to let go? Either way, it worked, at least enough that modern sleep sprays still borrow the same logic. Spray, breathe, pretend. But lavender was just the start. Chamomile made frequent appearances, steeped into thin tea that tasted like polite disappointment but promised a quieter night. Some added honey. Others sugar. If you were particularly brave, you mixed it with valerian root, smelling like old gym socks but renowned even then for its sedative properties. You lie there, imagining someone steeping these herbs with stiff fingers, stirring in silence, counting each breath as if afraid to lose track of it. The tea isn't a treat. It's a task. A signal that sleep must arrive, because the day has demanded too much. Rosewater, too, played a part. Not just for beauty but for bedtime. A handkerchief dabbed with rosewater, pressed gently to the eyes, meant to cool, to soothe, to carry you off. It was the kind of ritual you might have seen in a wealthier home. Upstairs, beyond the servants' staircase. A lady, her corset finally unhooked, dabbing her temples with fragrant water, blinking slowly as the gaslight guttered. Even citrus had its believers. Orange flower water, in particular, was thought to refresh the body and restore tranquility. You could sprinkle it onto a warm cloth and drape it across your forehead like a makeshift halo. Or mix it into a sweet drink before bed, swirling your worries with each diluted drop. But while some people relied on botanicals, others turned to stranger scents. Mugwort, for instance, was believed to enhance dreams, especially the prophetic kind. You might burn it like incense or stuff it into your pillow, hoping your subconscious would yield something worth interpreting. Dream divination wasn't just for mystics, it was common among housewives, clerks, and sailors. Even if you didn't believe, it gave the darkness a purpose. And then there was vinegar. Yes, vinegar. Soaked cloths hung near the bed. Bowls placed on windowsills. It was meant to purify the air, or, in grimmer cases, to mask the smell of sickness or the city itself. Vinegar didn't smell good, exactly. But it smelled like something, which was sometimes enough. Enough to cut through the staleness. Enough to tell you that someone was trying. You imagine yourself in a boarding house, nose wrinkling at the sharp tang hanging in the air. A communal experiment in not breathing too deeply. But somehow, even that acrid familiarity becomes a comfort. At least the vinegar means someone still cares whether you catch cold. Smell was only part of it. The ritual mattered, too. There were those who swore by footbaths before bed. Not for cleanliness, though that helped, but for the relaxing effect of hot water on cold feet. You'd soak your toes in a shallow tin basin, watching the steam rise like a tired ghost. Sometimes they'd toss in mustard powder or dried herbs. And as your skin pinkened and softened, your mind would follow, inching towards sleep. It's a shame we let go of that habit. Something about washing the day off, quite literally, has its appeal. Especially when sleep feels distant. Especially when your blankets aren't warm enough, or your thoughts are too loud. You shift, pressing your face deeper into the pillow. Just for a moment, you pretend it smells like lavender. Or maybe rose. Or something gently bitter and herbal. Something from another time. Don't forget the pillows themselves, stuffed not just with feathers but sometimes with dried hops or hay scented with flowers. Hops, the same plant used in brewing beer, was believed to ease anxiety and induce drowsiness. A hop pillow might smell a bit like an old bar mat, but if it worked, who cared? And in poorer homes, people made do. They'd collect drying herbs from market scraps or the edges of fields. Wrap them in old handkerchiefs. Tie them with string. Anything to trick the brain into softening its grip on the day. You think about how odd it must have felt, sleeping beside someone and trying to pretend you didn't notice their pillows suddenly smelled like moldy ale. But again, the act of doing something, anything, to invite rest was half the battle. The other half? Well, sometimes that came down to sheer willpower. Or exhaustion. Or just praying that the candle wouldn't tip over in the night. Scent wasn't only about comfort. Sometimes it was about memory. A sachet that reminded you of home. A bottle of oil from a long-dead aunt's dresser. Even a bar of cheap soap, so floral it felt like a punch in the nose, could be a kind of tether, a reminder that the world could still be soft, sometimes. If you squinted. The night is still. Not silent, but softer. You breathe deep again, and though your room is scentless, your mind is full, lavender fields, vinegar bowls, and strange little pillows filled with half-believed hopes. The dreams they carried may be long gone. But tonight, maybe they'll carry you. You blink, slowly now. The ghosts in the wallpaper have quieted down, and your room, though it still breathes with the distant wheeze of old plumbing and imaginary carriages, is easing into that familiar hush. But in Victorian London, quiet didn't always mean peace. And sleep, well, sleep had rules. See, the Victorians were obsessed with doing things properly. That included bedtime. There was a right way to fall asleep, and you, dear listener, probably aren't doing it correctly, at least not by 19th century standards. Start with position. Back then, sleeping on your side was encouraged, especially the right side, which was believed to aid digestion. Sleeping flat on your back. Dangerous. Doctors warned it might cause sleep paralysis or even attract malevolent spirits. The left side was seen as vaguely rebellious, possibly because it put pressure on the heart, or, more scandalously, because it was associated with left-handedness, which Victorians still found deeply suspicious. Historians still argue whether these positions actually mattered or were just polite ways to keep people from snoring through paper-thin walls. But books of the time were adamant. The medical posture of sleep was a side sleep, with legs only slightly curled. You were meant to look serene. Like a romantic statue. No flopping, no flailing. Just graceful unconsciousness. There were even rules for your sheets. Tightly tucked corners. A single blanket in summer. 2 in winter, unless you were a child, in which case you got 3, plus a hot brick at your feet. Not out of generosity, mind you, but because children were seen as naturally chaotic sleepers. The extra weight was like a Victorian weighted blanket, equal parts warmth and restraint. Speaking of children, their sleep was obsessively monitored. Infants were trained to sleep through the night early, with sleep discipline often involving strict feeding schedules, blackout nurseries, and a complete lack of nighttime cuddles. The goal wasn't comfort, it was quiet. A well-sleeping baby meant a quiet house, and a quiet house was a mark of moral virtue. You imagine a tiny nursery, wallpapered with pale animals that seem vaguely judgmental. A nanny tiptoes in with a stopwatch and a grimace. No one dares to coo. Instead, she fluffs the blanket, adjusts the pillow with military precision, and slips away, hoping the baby doesn't twitch. Then there was ventilation. Fresh air was vital, but also feared. Windows were cracked, never opened fully. You needed air, but not too much. A draft could kill you, after all. People would wedge pillows into corners, place screens in front of beds, or even wear nightcaps long enough to tuck into their mouths like makeshift air filters. And let's talk about those nightcaps. They weren't just fashion accessories for Dickensian ghosts. They served real purposes, keeping the head warm in frigid, fireless bedrooms, muffling outside sounds, and sometimes, frankly, hiding bad hair. They came in all shapes, some resembled floppy elf hats, others were closer to bonnets. A truly stylish sleeper wouldn't be caught dead without one. Though, of course, many were caught dead in one. But that's another story. Victorians didn't just sleep, they prepared for it like a mission. A hot drink, a footbath, a prayer, and possibly a last check under the bed for burglars or rats. Maybe both. After all, the city didn't sleep just because you did. Down in the streets, the night shift moved on, costermongers, chimney sweeps, watchmen, and the occasional opium-addled poet scribbling under a street lamp. Inside, meanwhile, you might whisper a few lines of scripture or recite a memorized poem. Something to usher in the night. Some favored psalms, others chose Tennyson. One particularly gloomy rector once advised his congregation to fall asleep with one's sins cradled in reflection, lest the soul depart before morn. Sweet dreams indeed. Still, many believed the hour before sleep, the hypnagogic moment, held special power. That your thoughts then could shape your dreams. Some even kept sleep journals, writing down worries or dreams they hoped to conjure. Others consulted dream dictionaries, convinced that sleeping on a question would bring a symbolic answer. If you dreamt of teeth falling out, death in the family, flying, a sign of moral temptation, bananas. Strangely, those meant a sudden journey. Interpretations varied wildly, but dream logic was its own art form. And don't forget the bells. Church bells, factory bells, and the mournful toll of Big Ben, always present, always reminding you that time didn't pause for sleep. Each hour echoed through the fog, a slow thump to keep your subconscious tethered to the waking world. You roll over, imagining the weight of wool blankets pressing in. Your breath muffled by layers of ticking and linen. The air just slightly musty from the fireplace ash. Somewhere in another room, someone stirs, or coughs, or closes a shutter. The city doesn't stop. It only changes tone. Some beds were grand, for posters with velvet hangings. Others were cots, pallets, or even straw sacks on the floor. But whatever your bed, it had a role. It had a discipline. It wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a stage. And every night, you stepped onto it for the slow performance of unconsciousness. The stillness of the room mattered. Victorians feared overstimulation. Bright wallpaper, too many books, noisy clocks, these were all accused of disrupting the delicate dance toward sleep. Bedrooms were supposed to be boring. Monotony was the medicine. And yes, that included the color scheme. Pale blues, grays, and creams ruled the space. Colors that wouldn't get too excited. You can almost feel it now, can't you? That hush. That carefully engineered boredom. The soft creak of a bed frame. The smell of starch. The slow surrender. Of course, not everyone bought into it. Some scoffed at all the bedtime rituals. Artists and writers often boasted of sleeping irregularly, refusing to be tamed by clock or custom. There were famous eccentrics who swore by midday naps and candlelit vigils at 3 a.m., their version of rebellion. Their version of freedom. But for the vast majority, sleep was structure. A shape to the chaos. A nightly surrender to rules meant to keep the body still, the mind calm, and the spirit, if not saved, at least subdued. And so you lie there, partway between then and now. Wrapped in imaginary wool. Breathing air just dusty enough to feel real. Listening for bells that never ring outside your window. Wondering if you, too, are sleeping the correct way, or if you're just floating like everyone else, half awake in history's bed. Your eyes flutter shut, but the darkness in this imagined room isn't quite empty. There's a subtle rustle, not a mouse, probably, though you wouldn't put it past the old floorboards, and then, faintly, the sound of metal tapping ceramic. A spoon. Stirring. Again. Slowly. Because tonight's elixir is not just warm, it's critical. And if you lived in Victorian London, it might be your only hope of drifting off before dawn broke over the coal-stained rooftops. You're about to meet the true legends of the late-night kitchen, the sleep drinks. Or, as one 1872 housewife scribbled into her recipe book, somniferous concoctions. It sounds medical. It wasn't. Let's start with the simplest, most suspiciously innocent, warm milk. Not just any milk, mind you. The milk was often boiled, then cooled to just below scalding, and sometimes laced with nutmeg or cinnamon. It wasn't about flavor. These were medicinal spices, warming, digestive, supposedly hypnotic. People genuinely believed nutmeg, in particular, could coax the brain into quietude. You sip and picture it, slightly curdled from the heat, but still comfortingly bland, like a hug from someone who doesn't know you well. But it didn't stop there. Enter, toast water. Yes, you heard that right. A scorched piece of stale bread, dunked in boiling water, and left to steep like a very unambitious tea. Toast water was meant to be sipped slowly. It was gentle. It was starchy. And it tasted, like surrender. It lined the stomach, they said, and lulled the nervous system into a docile daze. You wouldn't order it at a cafe. But if you were broke, anxious, and full of gaslight-fueled dread, you might sip it at 11 p.m. and hope for the best. Historians still argue whether toast water ever did anything meaningful. Was it the carbs? The warmth? The sheer monotony of the flavor? Or was it just that same old trick, the ritual, quietly convincing your brain that bedtime had arrived? There were, of course, more creative options. Some households served poppy syrup, a sweetened extract of opium poppy meant for children and the elderly. Yes, they gave that to babies. And no, it wasn't always supervised. A few drops to still the nerves, the bottle said. You can practically see the cursive lettering, the cork stopper, the confident recklessness of it all. Opium, as we now know, is not exactly a mild sleep aid. But for Victorians, it was as common as aspirin. Some used laudanum, opium mixed with alcohol, added to tea or warm ale before bed. Others bought soothing syrup, sold at apothecaries with no labels beyond a general promise of peace. A fringe recipe included lettuce water, literally boiling lettuce leaves in water and drinking the strained liquid. People swore it relaxed the muscles. You imagine sipping it, grimacing slightly, and pretending to feel something. Maybe you do. Maybe it's placebo. Maybe it's just your body giving up. Then there was posset. A drink made from hot milk curdled with wine or ale, sometimes thickened with oats, eggs, or even breadcrumbs. It was sort of a liquid pudding, sort of a beverage, sort of a dare. Richer homes spiced theirs with mace and clove. Poorer ones skipped the eggs and settled for warmth alone. Possets were old, medieval, even, but in Victorian homes, they lingered. Grandmothers whispered recipes. Sick rooms served them. They smelled like comfort and desperation in equal measure. You shift slightly in your blankets, imagining the heaviness of a belly full of thick, boozy milk. You'd have to sleep. You wouldn't have a choice. Of course, not everyone preferred drinks. Some chewed herbs. Yes, chewed them. Valerian root, lemon balm, or woodruff, tiny bits kept in handkerchiefs or boxes, sucked or gnawed like calming lozenges. The taste was often described as earthy. Or, less kindly, like licking a church floor. Then there were the mysterious nighttime cordials. Sold by traveling salesmen and tucked behind dusty pharmacy counters. Their ingredients were guarded like secrets. Hints of chamomile, maybe. Tinctures of opium, definitely. Sometimes turpentine or belladonna, both of which should not, under any circumstances, be consumed. But in Victorian London, if it came in a bottle and promised sleep, someone was buying it. You picture the label, Dr. Penweather's Nocturnal Repose Elixir. Swirly script. A slightly smug-looking owl. You're tempted to believe it might actually work. Even if your heart stops along the way. Sleep drinks weren't just about pharmacology. They were part of a bedtime choreography. You didn't just gulp and flop into bed. You warmed your hands on the cup. You sat near the fire, or pretended you had one. You looked into the flames, or the imagined ones in your gas lamp, and tried to see your worries dissolve. You sipped. Slowly. Letting the heat collect behind your ribs. And once the drink was done, you rinsed the cup. Set it gently in the basin. Blew out the candle. Not fast. Not dramatically. Just enough to say, I'm finished. I'm ready. Of course, there were skeptics. Medical men who wrote stern letters to journals, warning about household quackery and the dangers of nocturnal concoctions. They claimed most sleep drinks were useless, if not harmful. And they were often right. But try telling that to someone who hasn't slept in 3 days and just watched a rat run across the gaslight's reflection. You'd sip anything. There were outliers, too, people who made their own blends. Rooftop gardeners harvesting herbs, widowers mixing spice and honey, children mimicking grown-ups with their own bedtime teas. Not all were effective. But all were rituals. And that, more than the ingredients, was the point. You breathe in again, slow now, as if the ghost of warm toast water is lingering on your tongue. There's something soothing about imagining it. The heat. The weight in your stomach. The way your hands would have cradled the cup just a moment longer than necessary, just to stretch out the piece. In the end, sleep wasn't just coaxed. It was earned. Boiled. Stirred. Steeped. Sipped. A small ceremony in kitchens too cold to sit in during the day, but just warm enough for one final cup before surrendering to the dark. You settle deeper now, wondering what your modern bedtime drink would have looked like back then. Probably laughed at. But who cares? You've got warmth. You've got calm. And in some quiet, imagined kitchen, a teacup clinks, and the night stirs once more. Now that you've had your toast water and a sip of something vaguely medicinal, the room around you feels heavier, like the curtains of an old theater beginning to close. But before they shut completely, let's step into the odd little world of Victorian sleep accessories, those strange, forgotten bedtime companions that once crowded nightstands and filled drawers in bedrooms across London. Start with the sleep mask. Not the silk-lined glamour masks of today, but clunky, handmade affairs, some sewn from thick black cloth, others repurposed from old bonnets, eye bandages, or even repurposed mourning veils. Their job was simple: block out the creeping glow of street lamps or the moon glaring through soot-smudged windows. But the effect? Slightly sinister. Like a burglar wearing their own disguise to bed. These masks were sometimes soaked in lavender oil or rosewater, believed to soothe the mind and deter headaches. But whether they calmed or just mildly suffocated you is still up for debate. Historians still argue whether these masks were genuinely helpful or simply another Victorian overcorrection, yet one more thing between the body and true rest. Then there were bed socks. Not just for warmth, but for hygiene. Feet were rarely washed, and bed sheets weren't changed often. So thick woolen socks acted like barriers between grimy feet and precious linens. Some people even sprinkled their socks with dried herbs or talcum powder, believing the scent would rise and lull them into dreams. Others just hoped their partner wouldn't notice the cheese-like aroma seeping from the wool. Hot bricks were another nightly necessity. They were often wrapped in flannel and placed at the foot of the bed, or hidden beneath thick quilts to keep the mattress warm. Some swore by salt-filled bricks or iron pans filled with coals, but this had one clear drawback: sometimes your bed caught fire. So enter the bed wagon. Yes, that's what they called it, a metal framework wheeled under the covers with hot coals safely stored in its center. You slept like royalty above a rolling stove. As long as you didn't move too much, or breathe too deeply. And what about the pillows? You had your standard goose feather options, sure, but also oddities like barley-stuffed or buckwheat pillows, meant to conform to your head. Some were filled with hay. Others, with herbs. There are documented cases of pillows containing dried hops, yes, the same kind used in beer. People believed the scent helped induce drowsiness. You imagine resting your cheek on something that smells like a brewery and hoping for peace. The dreams would at least be unique. In some more eccentric circles, animal magnetism pillows made the rounds. These were said to be aligned with the Earth's natural energies, supposedly channeling restful vibrations directly into the brain. Usually these were filled with magnetic sand or had small stones stitched inside. You couldn't move without rattling. But maybe the placebo effect worked. After all, if you told yourself it was healing you, maybe it would. Let's not forget the sleeping caps and gowns. Nightwear was not only functional, it was social armor. A well-made nightshirt could speak volumes about your class, your cleanliness, even your restraint. Women wore long, cotton gowns, high-necked with lace and cuffs. Men's shirts were often plain but buttoned so high you might as well be preparing for a duel with your own dreams. And if you really wanted to impress your guests, or your in-laws, you'd own a bed jacket. Worn while sitting up in bed to read or receive visitors. Yes, really, these jackets were often made of quilted silk or padded cotton. Think bathrobe, but make it Victorian and absurdly formal. Even the air in the room was accessorized. Scent diffusers were a thing, tiny terracotta discs infused with essential oils, or bowls of dried herbs tucked near the bed. Lavender was the star player, but some households swore by patchouli, sage, or bergamot. A few even leaned into more questionable choices like camphor or vinegar, claiming they cleared the brain fog. You can practically taste that in your throat just thinking about it. Oh, and for the truly restless, there were sleep bells. Not as in something to lull you to sleep, but an actual bell you could ring from your bedside to summon a servant or family member if you couldn't sleep. Imagine lying awake at 3:17 a.m. and ringing a little bronze bell because you needed someone to talk you down from your existential dread. What a luxury. What a burden, for everyone else. Some people kept stones beside the bed, not spiritual crystals, but literal polished river stones. Cold to the touch. Meant to be held, rotated in your hand, or pressed to the forehead to draw off excess thoughts. This is the kind of thing you'd expect from a sleep-deprived child, but no, respected adults swore by it. A fringe group even promoted sleep mirrors, small, covered mirrors near the bed that you were meant to uncover right before sleep. The theory? Seeing your face in dim candlelight reminded you of your mortality, which apparently soothed the soul. Or terrified it. There's a reason that one didn't catch on. And then, the bedside tables. They held more than just books or water. You'd often find a miniature oil lamp, a jar of ointment for chapped hands, and perhaps a phial of smelling salts, just in case sleep turned into swooning. Or a nightmare needed sniffing away. People didn't just sleep. They prepared for the journey like Arctic explorers. You wrap yourself in the imagined ritual now, adjusting the wool socks, setting the hot brick, pressing your hops-filled pillow flatter. Every item says, you are safe. You are ready. You may sleep. But underneath it all, there's a strange sort of tension. Victorian bedrooms weren't just about rest, they were stages for showing how properly one could suffer in style. Every accessory told a story. Of effort. Of class. Of craving peace in a city that barely blinked. You exhale. The air around you settles. You don't need hot bricks or barley pillows, but picturing them helps. The visual weight of all that effort. The collective determination of a society that believed, even wrongly, that sleep could be engineered. And as your own room quiets, you can almost hear it, the faint, imagined creak of bed frames, the soft clink of metal teacups, and the muted exhale of a city surrendering to the dark, one accessory at a time. The heavy scent of lavender and the faint hum of your imagined gas lamp start to fade as you sink deeper into this Victorian night, but now your mind drifts toward the peculiar customs surrounding bedtime itself. You might think it's simple, crawl into bed and close your eyes, but in 19th century London, getting ready to sleep was a whole ritual, like preparing for a delicate social dance where everyone is both exhausted and a bit anxious about what the night might bring. First, consider the timing. The day might end early, but the evening stretched on, especially in homes that could afford gas lighting or candles. Unlike our modern, dimmed, screen-heavy wind downs, Victorian evenings were often lit by flickering flames, and those flames shaped everything, the way shadows played on the wallpaper, the comfort of a fire, and the very pace at which you moved. Bedtime wasn't about collapsing but about a slow, deliberate unspooling of the day's tensions. You might begin with a bedtime toilette, which sounds fancy but was really just washing your face and hands at a basin in the bedroom. Sometimes, there'd be a small basin of warm water with a cloth or a soft brush for teeth cleaning, though toothpaste was in its infancy, so folks often used powders made from charcoal or chalk. You can almost taste the grit. Not soothing, but part of the expected ritual. This cleansing was more than hygiene, it was symbolic. You washed off the day's dirt, yes, but also, it marked a psychological boundary, from active, public life to private, vulnerable rest. You prepare your skin and your spirit for the quiet. The bedroom itself was a stage. Curtains were drawn, often heavy velvet or damask, not just to keep out light but to guard against drafts and the omnipresent cold that settled into London's brick walls. Window panes were single glass, so the chill seeped in despite the thick curtains. The bed curtains, if you were lucky enough to have them, closed around you like a protective cocoon. And then, there was the lighting. Candles were an obvious choice, but they flickered and posed fire risks, especially in rooms filled with flammable cloth. Gas lamps offered brighter, steadier light but could hiss and glow ominously, making shadows dance in eerie patterns. You might hold your breath as the lamp sputtered, hoping it didn't go out before you were tucked in. The flicker and hiss shaped your mindset. There's a certain edge to it, a quiet suspense, as if the night itself was an active participant in your sleep. Would the light last? Would the fire stay strong? Would the shadows in the corner move, or was that just the wallpaper's pattern? Some Victorian homes practiced early to bed, early to rise, but others pushed their evenings late with parlor games, card playing, or the obligatory reading aloud. Bedtime was flexible, especially in wealthier households where servants might wait for their masters to finally withdraw. But in poorer neighborhoods, bedtime was a different beast. Crowded rooms, noisy streets, and the lack of consistent lighting meant sleep came in stolen moments. Sometimes whole families shared a single bed. You can imagine the heavy sighs as little ones tried to nestle amid adults, the rustle of patched blankets, the murmur of whispered prayers or soothing songs. And then, there was the question of privacy. Bathrooms, as we know them, were rare, so bedroom activities, dressing, undressing, bathing, even using chamber pots, happened all in the same cramped space. You can feel the claustrophobia pressing in, the tension of bodies pressed close, trying to find comfort amid the unavoidable smells and sounds. To calm the nerves, some turned to reading before sleep. Not modern novels, no. More often, religious texts or poetry. Maybe a bit of Dickens, but even his tales could be grim enough to keep you awake. Sometimes the dim light revealed more than just words on the page, it revealed the worn edges of your fingers, the dust motes dancing in the air, the slow approach of night. Others preferred talking. You wouldn't just say goodnight and be done, you'd linger, swapping stories or worries, softly, so the walls didn't hear. Some Victorian psychologists later noted that this verbal release might help quell anxiety, though of course, historians still argue whether it was genuinely helpful or just a desperate attempt to fill the oppressive silence. Speaking of silence, it was rare. London was alive at night. The distant clatter of horse hooves, the rattle of carts, the cough of a street vendor, the occasional shout or bark. The city's heartbeat didn't quiet just because the lamps dimmed. Many people used white noise of their time, like the crackling fire, the ticking of clocks, or the distant church bells, to drown out these disturbances. Some even resorted to old wives' tales, filling drawers with small bags of dried herbs or placing bowls of water near the bed to absorb bad dreams or evil spirits. The supernatural was never far in Victorian sleep lore. Finally, there was the actual act of lying down. It might sound simple, but many believed that how you positioned yourself mattered. Sleeping on your back was seen by some as inviting bad spirits, while others recommended the left side to encourage better digestion and calm the heart. In fact, sleeping postures were so serious that some wealthy Victorians had beds designed with adjustable headrests or elaborate supports for knees and feet. You can picture someone lying there, propped up just so, trying to keep restless limbs at bay. If you ever find yourself tossing and turning tonight, imagine the Victorians' dilemma: hard beds stuffed with straw or feathers, lumpy mattresses that shifted under your weight, and the persistent chill creeping from the walls. You'd pull the quilt tighter, adjust your pillow, and maybe say a silent prayer that morning would come quickly. So, as you let your body sink into whatever modern mattress you're lucky to have, remember this: sleep, even then, was never just about closing your eyes. It was a careful choreography of light, warmth, sound, and ritual. And somehow, through all the odd customs and remedies, people still found their way to rest. The night deepens, and now your thoughts drift to the many strange, forgotten liquids Victorians believed could lull you to sleep, or at least keep you from staring at the ceiling, counting smog particles. You probably know about laudanum, that infamous opium tincture whispered about in Victorian novels and dark corners, but the real sleepy potions ran far wider, and far weirder, than that. Start with the humble glass of warm milk. Yes, the same comforting cup many of us still swear by, but Victorian London's version had a twist. Often the milk was soaked directly into a piece of toasted bread before being eaten. This wasn't just a carb-and-calcium combo, it was thought to be a magic sleep ticket. The bread absorbed the milk, making it easier to digest and believed to slowly release calming compounds through the night. You imagine chewing soggy toast while hoping your restless brain finally shuts off. Historians still argue whether this toast and milk trick was actually soothing or just a comforting ritual passed down through generations, like a warm blanket for the nerves. But milk wasn't alone in the nightcap lineup. There were cordials, concoctions of herbs, spices, and sweeteners, sometimes infused with gentle sedatives like valerian root or hops. Some recipes included rosewater for floral notes or a splash of brandy for that just enough buzz to slip towards sleep without tumbling into drunkenness. More unusual were night tinctures sold at apothecaries, small glass bottles filled with mixtures so complex they read like early chemistry experiments. Ingredients ranged from chamomile and lemon balm to belladonna, hyoscyamus, and sometimes a pinch of strychnine, which was wildly dangerous but occasionally included in tiny doses. You shudder to think of someone carefully dosing themselves with a mystery potion each night, hoping it would work without turning into a poison story. On the fringes, some Victorians embraced opodeldoc or diar. Lowcock's pills, patent medicines that promised restful nights among other miraculous cures. The problem? They were often just sugary powders with a hint of morphine or other narcotics, creating dependency disguised as a cure. The sleeping draught became an open secret in many households, a sleep aid passed between desperate hands like a forbidden recipe. You can almost hear the debates among doctors and pharmacists of the time, who simultaneously warned against these remedies and prescribed them with a wink. Historians still argue how widespread the use of opiates really was, and whether Victorian sleep was more chemically induced than we like to admit. Some went down a more botanical path, brewing teas from lavender, chamomile, or lemon balm. These mild relaxants were safe enough to give to children, though you'd probably still grimace at the idea of warm herb-infused water in place of a good night's Netflix. The ritual of steeping tea, letting it cool, sipping slowly, it was as much about calming the mind as the body. But what really catches your eye, and maybe your nose, are the more pungent concoctions. You might find a bottle of camphor spirit by the bedside, a solution of camphor in alcohol, inhaled or dabbed behind the ears to clear the mind and chase away restless energy. Imagine the sharp, mentholated scent wafting through a candlelit bedroom, cutting through the thick fog of soot and sweat. Whether it helped sleep or just masked the smells of a grimy city is still debated. Then there's the curious case of milk punch. A boozy blend of milk, spirits, sugar, and sometimes spices, served warm. You can picture a Victorian sipping this near the fire, toes warming, body slowly surrendering to the gentle buzz. It's the ancestor of the modern eggnog, only far less festive and far more about survival. Don't forget the role of bitters, too. Tinctures made from gentian root or wormwood weren't just for digestion, they were thought to settle nerves, calm the stomach, and by extension, soothe the mind. You could sip a bitter at bedtime, grimacing but hopeful. In wealthier homes, these nightcap concoctions might be prepared by a knowledgeable servant or apothecary, carefully measured and dosed. In poorer neighborhoods, they were more likely bought from street vendors selling medicinal brews of questionable quality, sometimes laced with everything from soot to chalk to cheap liquor. Not exactly a recipe for restful sleep, but it was what was available. Some Victorians even experimented with dream waters, mixtures that claimed to induce pleasant dreams or prophetic visions. These mysterious brews contained a mix of herbs and sometimes minute doses of narcotics. You can almost hear the hush of curious skeptics and the wide eyes of hopeful dreamers as they swirled these liquids before bed, chasing a night of visions instead of nightmares. Of course, not all nighttime drinks were meant to calm. Some were more stimulating, like hot tea with a hint of gin, consumed late into the evening in an attempt to keep the gloom of the long night at bay. You can almost see the irony, drinking spirits to stay awake, then downing tinctures to fall asleep. The Victorian night was a strange balancing act. So, as you consider your own bedtime ritual, whether a herbal tea, a sleepy podcast, or a quick scroll through your phone, think about that toast soaked in milk, the camphor scent hanging in the air, the careful dosing of tinctures with names you can barely pronounce. Sleep was never just sleep. It was a cocktail of tradition, hope, and chemistry. And just maybe, in the glow of your own modern nightlight, you can appreciate how far, and how bizarrely, humans have gone to catch those elusive moments of rest. The night wears on, and now you're drawn to the peculiar ways Victorians tried to coax their minds into a peaceful surrender, beyond potions and hot bricks. Let's wander into the forgotten world of Victorian sleep psychology, a field barely recognized at the time but full of fascinating attempts to tame the restless brain. You might think Victorian brains were no different from ours, but their understanding of the mind's nocturnal chaos was oddly tangled with superstition, philosophy, and emerging science. The Victorians believed that the mind wasn't just a blank slate before sleep but a battlefield where daily worries, moral concerns, and spiritual dilemmas wrestled for dominance. Many believed that a cluttered conscience meant a cluttered night. So, journaling before bed was surprisingly common, not exactly the Instagram story kind, but lengthy moral reflections, prayers, or confessions penned in fading candlelight. This wasn't just therapy, it was a spiritual house cleaning, a way to put your thoughts in order and convince yourself that you deserved rest. Historians still argue how widespread this practice really was, but the evidence of diaries and letters suggests it wasn't rare. If journaling wasn't your style, meditation, or what passed for it, was. No one called it meditation, of course, but some advocated a form of mental stilling, where you'd sit quietly, eyes closed, breathing steadily, and imagine yourself in a safe, peaceful place. Maybe a quiet garden, or a countryside meadow. It sounds like the meditation apps of today but without the soothing voiceover. On the fringes, a few Victorian health enthusiasts endorsed guided imagery techniques, though they'd call it mental traveling or conscious dreaming. You'd visualize your troubles shrinking or floating away like fog. This was all before Freud's dream theories, so it wasn't yet about subconscious revelations but about practical calming. If these techniques sound too sensible, brace yourself for the odd practice of sleep prayer. Not just a quick good night, but a lengthy litany of verses, recited or memorized, to banish anxiety and invite divine protection. Victorian homes often had prayer books open on bedside tables, and some families insisted on nightly devotions before lights out. It's easy to imagine a tired soul muttering psalms, hoping to quiet the racing heart. Music was also part of the mix, but not modern lullabies or classical tunes. Instead, some people swore by musical glasses, or singing bowls, sets of tuned glasses filled with water that could be gently rubbed to create ethereal tones. The sound was meant to harmonize the brainwaves, promoting sleep. Experimental? Absolutely. Effective? Historians still debate. Then there were those who experimented with physical manipulations of the body to encourage mental calm. The cold water dousing, for example, was both a wake-up and wind-down method, a quick splash of cold water on the face or wrists believed to reset the nervous system. Some even recommended cold foot baths before bed, awful, but apparently invigorating enough to aid sleep. You wonder if they'd tried it themselves, or just enjoyed watching others suffer. On the more fringe side, a few Victorians tried hypnotic suggestions. It was early days for hypnosis, and some physicians claimed they could induce sleep by speaking softly, repeating phrases, or using swinging pendulums, methods still controversial today. You can picture a dimly lit parlor with a serious doctor leaning in, voice smooth as silk, promising dreams without nightmares. Whether it worked or was just theatrical is another historical debate. Of course, the Victorians were obsessed with dreams themselves, viewing them as moral messages, spiritual warnings, or glimpses of the future. Dream interpretation manuals were bedside staples in some homes, filled with cryptic symbols and their supposed meanings. You might find yourself flipping through a book that says dreaming of rats means hidden enemies, or that seeing water symbolizes emotional cleansing. But beware, some advice was downright contradictory. One dream manual might tell you to confront your nightmares, another to avoid thinking of bad things before bed. The moral ambiguity of sleep extended even into what you dreamed. And if your dreams weren't pleasant, some Victorian remedies included dream pillows filled with lavender or hops to sweeten the night, or a sachet of valerian root placed under your pillow. This is where the lines between mental and physical sleep aids blur, a cozy intersection of herbal magic and psychological hope. The Victorian night was a complex ecosystem of mind and body, tradition and experimentation. People fought restlessness not only with tinctures and accessories but by trying to master their own minds. They wrestled with anxiety in candlelight, hoping to trade their waking worries for restful slumber. As you tuck yourself in tonight, imagine tracing your fingers over those worn journals or listening to the gentle hum of a glass bowl. The quest for sleep has always been the same, an intimate battle against noise, shadows, and thoughts that refuse to quiet down. And while your bedroom might lack the Victorian charm, or the cold foot baths, remember that your restless nights are part of a long human story, one filled with hope, odd inventions, and the universal desire to simply sleep. The stillness of the night settles around you as you now consider the physical environments where Victorians actually tried to rest, the beds themselves and the curious contraptions that surrounded them. These were no mere slabs of foam and fabric, but elaborate stages for sleep, where every detail mattered, and sometimes, a little discomfort was considered a virtue. Picture your bedroom back then, a heavy, often four-poster bed with thick curtains, looming like a protective fortress. These curtains weren't just decoration, they kept out drafts, the chill from single-pane windows, and the prying eyes of other household members or curious neighbors. Imagine tugging those heavy fabrics around you, cocooning yourself in a dim, muffled world, separated from the noisy London streets. The mattress itself was a different story. No memory foam, no pocket springs, mostly straw or feathers stuffed into ticking, often uneven and lumpy. The poor might sleep on hard boards covered with a thin blanket, while wealthier folk had feather beds so soft that sinking in was almost like floating. However, those feather beds sometimes caused allergies or uncomfortable heat, leading to restless nights. Some Victorian health advisors insisted on firm mattresses, arguing that a hard bed helped posture and prevented the dreaded, nervous exhaustion. Historians still debate whether this was genuine health advice or just class-based discomfort masked as virtue. Beneath your mattress, you might find layers of tick stuffing, horsehair, wool, or even dried bracken. It's easy to picture tiny bugs, mites, and dust flourishing in this bedding buffet, adding their own kind of background noise to your nights. Fleas were common, and the widespread use of mothballs, camphor, or lavender sachets wasn't just for scent but a desperate attempt to repel these nocturnal invaders. You can almost itch just thinking about it. The bed frame, often made of heavy wood or iron, sometimes creaked or groaned in the night. Imagine that noise echoing in a quiet house, breaking the silence, and sometimes startling sleepers awake. The creak became a soundtrack of the night, sometimes comforting, like a familiar old tune, and sometimes a nuisance. Now, focus on pillows, a surprisingly controversial item. Feather pillows were popular among the well-off, but they often caused headaches or neck pain. Others preferred straw or wool pillows, but these were prickly and less supportive. Some health guides even warned against pillows altogether, claiming they caused spinal issues or poor circulation. You might imagine a Victorian shrugging off modern comfort trends, sleeping flat as a board, with a stiff neck as the price of good health. Alongside the bed were washstands with basins, chamber pots tucked discreetly under tables, and night lights, small candles or oil lamps that emitted a faint glow. The choice of light mattered greatly. Too bright, and your body's melatonin production would falter; too dim, and you risked fumbling or stubbing toes in the dark. The precarious balance made the act of getting into bed a slow, careful dance. Some beds were designed with a feature called the tester, a canopy frame that allowed for mosquito netting or heavy curtains. In London, mosquitoes were less of a problem than in colonies, but drafts and soot particles made the canopy useful. Some historians suggest the canopy bed was more a status symbol by this point, a sign of wealth and refinement, but it still served practical purposes. Interestingly, you might find a warming pan in many homes, a long-handled metal pan filled with hot coals, carefully slid between the sheets before bedtime. The warming pan was the Victorian answer to our electric blankets, delivering a gentle heat that chased away the chill. However, wielding it required skill. Too hot, and you'd wake up with burns; too cold, and the night would be no warmer than before. In smaller homes or among the working class, beds were often shared by multiple people, crammed together for warmth and space. This created a communal sleep experience that was less private and more about survival. Imagine the cacophony of snoring, restless shifting, and the occasional complaint over space. The idea of sleep hygiene was beginning to take shape. Advice on regular bedtimes, fresh air in the bedroom, and cleanliness, but the practical realities of cramped, smoky, and sometimes filthy urban homes made these ideals hard to achieve. Scholars still debate how much the poor could follow such recommendations, or if these were just polite suggestions for the middle and upper classes. One more curious Victorian sleep accessory was the bed warmer glove, a thick, padded glove worn on the hand to test the temperature of the bed before settling in, or to hold the warming pan safely. The glove was a symbol of careful preparation, a small but significant detail in the ritual of bedtime. As you imagine yourself slipping beneath those heavy curtains, onto a feather-stuffed mattress that creaks with your every move, warmed by a glowing pan and cocooned in layers of blankets and scents, you realize that Victorian sleep was as much about endurance as it was about rest. Comfort was relative, and the battle against cold, pests, and noise was never far away. So, while your own bed might not have curtains thick enough to block the world, or a pan full of hot coals lurking nearby, take a moment to appreciate the cozy complexity of Victorian sleep spaces, a world of protection, ritual, and just a touch of discomfort that somehow made rest possible. As you nestle deeper into that Victorian bed, your mind might wander to the very air you breathe in the bedroom, the often overlooked but crucial ingredient in the recipe for sleep. London's infamous fog and soot weren't just outdoor nuisances, they seeped indoors, turning bedrooms into arenas of questionable air quality. Victorians were well aware that fresh air mattered. "Open a window," was a common refrain from health reformers and doctors alike. Yet, in a city wrapped in smog and industrial haze, that simple advice was easier said than done. You can imagine the dilemma: open the window and invite the cold, damp night in, or keep it shut and choke on the stale, smoky air. Many families employed a curious invention called the airing cupboard, a small, heated closet designed to warm linens and blankets. The idea was that warm bedding, free from dampness and odors, would promote better sleep. But heating systems were unreliable, and sometimes the airing cupboard became a humid trap for mildew, rather than a sanctuary of freshness. To combat the pervasive smell and stale air, Victorians turned to aromatic herbs and oils. Lavender was king, placed in pillows, scattered on floors, or brewed into sprays. Rosemary, mint, and thyme also made appearances, either burned as incense or tucked in sachets. The smell was believed not only to mask the urban stink but to ward off miasmas, or invisible poisons thought to cause disease. Historians still argue whether these fragrant defenses had any real effect on health or sleep quality. The advent of coal gas lighting brought its own challenges. Gas lamps released carbon monoxide and other pollutants, making indoor air less breathable. Turning off lamps before bed was not just about saving coal but about protecting fragile lungs. Yet, many people needed light to read or perform evening chores, so bedrooms were often filled with a mix of smoke and soot. Ventilation was a tricky affair. Some houses had air bricks, small holes in walls meant to allow airflow, but their effectiveness varied. You can picture a Victorian fiddling with shutters, curtains, and fireplace dampers, trying to balance warmth, light, and fresh air. It was a nightly negotiation between comfort and health. The night air itself was a source of folklore and fear. Many believed that cold night air could cause illness or exacerbate nervous conditions. Doctors warned against sleeping with windows wide open in winter, advocating instead for just a crack of fresh air. This cautious approach was a middle ground, but one that often left bedrooms feeling stuffy. In wealthier homes, early versions of mechanical ventilation appeared, fans and ducts that could pull stale air out and bring fresh air in. These systems were rare and expensive, but they marked the beginning of modern climate control in bedrooms. Meanwhile, the poor made do with whatever gaps and cracks their homes provided. Humidifiers and dehumidifiers were not yet a thing, but Victorians had creative workarounds. Hanging wet sheets in rooms was sometimes recommended to increase humidity in dry winters, while in damp conditions, coal fires and open hearths helped dry the air. Another curious remedy was the fresh air treatment, where patients were encouraged to spend the night outdoors in tents or open-air beds, especially those suffering from consumption, tuberculosis. The idea of sleeping exposed to the elements might seem extreme now, but it was part of a larger health movement that prized natural air as a cure-all. Victorian bedrooms also hosted an array of houseplants believed to purify the air. English ivy, spider plants, and ferns were popular, not just for decoration but for their supposed ability to absorb toxins. You might imagine a bed surrounded by pots and greenery, an early experiment in biophilic design. Despite all these efforts, indoor air quality remained a persistent problem, one that surely disrupted sleep for many. The fog, soot, and cramped quarters created a cocktail of pollutants that modern air purifiers only began to combat a century later. As you breathe in the imagined scent of lavender, mixed with faint coal smoke and the earthy hint of old wood, you realize that Victorian sleep wasn't just about what happened in bed but the very atmosphere around it, thick, smoky, fragrant, and forever in negotiation with the city outside. So next time you open your window before sleep, remember that for Victorians, that simple act was both a comfort and a gamble, balancing freshness against the harsh realities of London's smoky nights. You're now sinking deeper into the Victorian nighttime ritual, where every scent, sound, and shadow played a part in the elusive dance toward sleep. And no Victorian bedroom was complete without the presence of bedside companions, not pets, but something far more peculiar, the ever-present bedside table with its mysterious arsenal of sleep aids, odd remedies, and curious gadgets. Your Victorian bedside table would likely be cluttered with an assortment of objects, each promising to ease the passage into dreamland or protect against restless nights. Unlike today's neat nightstands, Victorian tables were mini apothecaries of hope and superstition. First up, the humble sleep-inducing tonic. Bottles of laudanum, a mix of opium and alcohol, were common household fixtures. It's hard to imagine, but laudanum was the go-to cure for insomnia, anxiety, and just about every nervous ailment. The irony? It was highly addictive and could lead to dangerous overdose, yet it was prescribed liberally, even to children. You might imagine a Victorian reaching for their laudanum with trembling fingers, hoping for sweet, drugged oblivion. Historians still debate the true scale of laudanum-related addiction and its role in Victorian society. Next, the bedside table might hold a box of soothing pastilles or herbal lozenges made from valerian root, hops, or chamomile, herbs famed for their calming properties. Unlike laudanum, these were gentler, less dangerous sleep aids, chewed slowly to relax the throat and mind. If you're lucky, you might spot a small, ornate, eye mask, though not the silk kind we're used to. These were often homemade cloths soaked in essential oils like lavender or rose water, folded and placed over the eyes to block light and soothe the senses. Light pollution was a real concern in the gaslit city, and Victorian insomnia was often blamed on too much light, so blocking it out was considered wise. Of course, there were books and pamphlets, sleep manuals filled with advice, moral lessons, and medical theories. Some suggested specific prayers, others recommended warm milk with toast, yes, the sleepy food classic you've heard about, and a few offered bizarre tips like sleeping with a gold coin under your pillow to ward off bad dreams or ensure prosperity in your sleep. The Victorian fascination with spiritualism meant that some bedside tables hosted spirit photographs or small charms, believed to protect the sleeper from evil spirits or nightmares. Remember, Victorian London was rife with ghost stories, and the boundary between the material and spiritual worlds was considered thin, especially at night. One particularly odd gadget was the sleeping belt, or nervous belt, a tight leather or elastic strap worn around the waist to provide gentle pressure, which was thought to soothe nerves and prevent nocturnal restlessness. You can imagine the discomfort and absurdity, but many swore by it. Then there were the bedroom clocks, not just any timekeepers but heavy, ticking devices that some believed helped regulate sleep cycles by providing a steady, comforting rhythm. Others found the ticking maddening, leading to anxious nights watching the seconds crawl. Victorian bedside tables also sometimes featured vapor lamps, early aromatic diffusers where a small flame heated a dish of herbs or oils, releasing fragrant steam into the air. This predecessor of modern essential oil diffusers was meant to purify the air and calm the senses. You might picture the faint lavender steam mingling with the coal smoke, an odd but soothing perfume. On the quirkier end, there was the practice of placing dream stones, small polished crystals or semi-precious stones, by the bedside. These were believed to promote peaceful dreams and protect against nightmares. Science has yet to prove any efficacy, but the sentimental value was high. Even the furniture's arrangement mattered. Victorian sleep hygiene texts advised placing the bed away from doors or windows to avoid drafts and disturbances, with the bedside table positioned to hold all your nightly essentials within easy reach. It was a carefully choreographed ritual space designed to cradle you through the night. And let's not forget the chamber pot, a bedside necessity in an era before indoor plumbing. While not glamorous, the pot was an essential part of the nighttime routine, ready for use without the need to stumble through dark, cold hallways. Its presence was so common that families often joked or grumbled about the inevitable smells and cleaning duties, a shared discomfort of Victorian life. All these items created a tactile, sensory environment that was part medicine cabinet, part superstition shrine, part comfort zone. Your fingertips brushing past bottles, the faint scent of herbs and opiates, the ticking clock, the coolness of a dream stone, all combined to create the atmosphere of Victorian slumber preparation. As you imagine your hand reaching across this cluttered table, you understand that Victorian sleep was more than rest. It was a carefully engineered event, involving ritual, hope, and sometimes desperation. The bedside table was a last bastion of control before surrendering to the unpredictable world of dreams and darkness. So, the next time you glance at your own bedside clutter, consider the legacy you share with these Londoners, souls who battled insomnia and anxiety with potions, prayers, and peculiar gadgets, all in the name of catching a few precious hours of sleep. As you rest there beside your cluttered Victorian bedside table, your thoughts might drift to the time just before bed, the evening rituals that framed the transition from waking to sleeping, and how the city's noisy, smoky chaos slowly faded into a quieter, sleep-ready cocoon. In Victorian London, evenings were a curious mix of industry winding down and social life kicking in. The streets buzzed with the clatter of horse-drawn carriages, the chatter of night markets, and the occasional distant howl of a stray dog. Yet, as darkness deepened, the city shifted gears into a slower, more somber rhythm. You trudged down a narrow, gas-lit street, your footsteps muffled by the thick fog that curls around your ankles, swallowing sound and light alike. At home, families gathered around flickering gas lamps or candles, their faces casting long, dancing shadows on wallpaper patterned with flowers or stripes, often faded and peeling. Dinner was usually the last big meal of the day, followed by small comforts like a warm drink or a bit of toast soaked in milk, an ancient sleep aid still beloved by many, especially children. Toast and milk might sound boring now, but it was a classic remedy believed to calm the nerves and prepare the body for rest. Scientists today still argue about the actual effectiveness of this practice, but it clearly held a special place in Victorian bedtime. After dinner, people engaged in quiet activities, reading by lamplight, mending clothes, or chatting in hushed tones. The evening paper, if affordable, was passed around, spreading news and sometimes sensational stories about crime, ghost sightings, or medical breakthroughs. Some households had music, perhaps a piano or a violin, while others relied on storytelling, sharing tales of distant lands or local legends, weaving a mental lullaby to coax the mind into sleep. Bathing habits varied widely. For the wealthy, a warm bath with fragrant soaps and oils was a nightly ritual believed to cleanse not just the body but the soul. For the working class, bath days were infrequent and often communal, taking place in public bathhouses rather than at home. Historians still debate how much these bathing patterns influenced sleep quality or general health. Lighting played a pivotal role in signaling the approach of bedtime. Gas lamps could be dimmed or extinguished gradually, mimicking dusk, while candles flickered softly, casting a warm glow. Too bright, and your eyes would strain, too dim, and you risked accidents in the dark. Some even used tinted glass shades to soften the harshness of the light. The dimming of lamps wasn't just practical, it was a psychological cue that the day was ending, your body's cue to wind down. For many Victorians, the evening also involved a period of quiet time, a practice recommended by doctors and moralists alike. This was a moment free from loud noises, heavy conversations, or stressful thoughts, an intentional pause to calm the mind. The phrase, "rest your nerves," was a catch-all for many ailments, and evening calm was thought to help with everything from indigestion to anxiety. You might imagine the slow closing of shutters and curtains, thick fabrics falling into place, muffling the noises of the street and sealing the room in a cocoon of privacy and warmth. The house quiets as the gas lamps burn low or flicker out entirely, replaced by the occasional night light or the faint glow of a fireplace ember. Before settling into bed, some took a moment for personal reflection or prayer. Victorian society was deeply religious, and many believed that a prayer at bedtime would bring peaceful dreams and protection through the night. Others simply paused in silence, focusing on breath and body, a rudimentary form of mindfulness that modern sleep science recognizes as beneficial. As you sit in that room, surrounded by the scents of candle wax, faint smoke, and lavender sachets, you can almost hear the distant city noises fading into the background, replaced by the softer, steadier sounds of home, the crackling fire, the ticking clock, the occasional creak of wood settling. Historians still debate how universal these evening rituals were. Did the poorest Londoners have time and energy for such quiet, or were their nights filled with different noises, worries, and routines? Sleep, after all, was a luxury many struggled to afford. In this delicate balance of light, sound, scent, and silence, the Victorian evening unfolded like a slow, deliberate curtain call, setting the stage for sleep's elusive arrival. And as you settle into that darkness, you're part of a long tradition, finding calm amid chaos, preparing your mind and body to surrender to rest. Now that you're comfortably tucked in, your thoughts might drift to the bed itself, its shape, size, and the peculiar comforts and discomforts of Victorian mattresses and bedding. Sleep, after all, happens in bed, and Victorian London's beds were quite a different experience from what you're probably used to. First, the frame. Beds were often massive wooden affairs, dark mahogany or oak, carved with ornate details that showcased the homeowner's status. These towering frames weren't just decorative, they served practical purposes. Canopies and heavy drapes surrounding the bed weren't just about style or privacy, they kept out drafts and trapped warmth in cold, drafty rooms. Imagine pulling those curtains closed as a ritual signal for sleep, shutting out the world. The mattress itself was typically made of horsehair, straw, or feathers stuffed into ticking fabric, a far cry from today's memory foam or spring coils. Horsehair mattresses were springy but could be uneven, and straw mattresses were cheap but lumpy and prone to attracting pests. Feathers were luxurious but expensive, and feather beds required regular beating to keep them fluffy. You can almost feel the firmness under your back, the uneven lumps pressing into your skin, a far cry from the plush comfort modern beds offer. Yet, in a way, these beds encouraged stillness. Movement could be uncomfortable, so staying still might have been easier, though not necessarily more restful. Bedding was layered, flannel sheets in winter to keep out the chill, cotton in summer, and heavy wool blankets or quilts piled high. Linen was prized for its breathability, but only the wealthy could afford fine flax. Bedclothes were washed less frequently than today, partly due to the labor involved, which historians still argue influenced sleep quality and hygiene. Pillows were stuffed with feathers or straw, with the feather pillows favored by those who could afford them for softness. But those same pillows could harbor dust mites and allergens, a Victorian mystery that caused nocturnal sneezing fits that doctors of the day often misattributed to night air. One odd Victorian sleep accessory was the bed warmer, a metal pan filled with hot coals, carefully placed under the bedclothes to warm the bed before you slipped in. It sounds cozy, but it was a careful dance not to set the sheets on fire or inhale too much smoke. The bed warmer was especially popular during bitter London winters, when homes were often cold and poorly insulated. Can you imagine the contrast between the warmth of the bed and the chill of the room? Many bedrooms lacked central heating, a fireplace was often the only source of warmth. But open flames came with risks, house fires were common, and many families feared waking to find their home in ashes. Mattresses and bedding were also battlefields against pests like bedbugs and fleas. Victorian houses, especially in poorer districts, were notorious for infestations. Remedies ranged from practical, regular airing and cleaning, to bizarre, sleeping with pungent herbs, scattering dried lavender, or even sprinkling arsenic powder, a dangerous, desperate measure. For the wealthy, feather mattresses were aired outdoors regularly, and servants helped maintain the bed's freshness. But for the working class, bedding was a heavy burden, often reused until it was worn thin and unhygienic. Historians still debate how much these factors, the firmness of mattresses, the quality of bedding, the presence of pests, affected the actual quality of Victorian sleep. Was the stiffness of a horsehair mattress a comfort or a curse? Did heavy blankets help or hinder body temperature regulation during sleep? As you settle into this bed, the creak of the frame and the rough texture of the sheets under your fingertips remind you that comfort is a relative concept. Victorian beds weren't always restful havens, they were practical, sometimes precarious, but always central to the nightly ritual of sleep. In this moment, as you feel the layered weight of quilts and the faint scent of lavender sachets tucked into the seams, you're experiencing a tactile connection to Victorian London's bedrooms, places of refuge, struggle, and hope for rest amid a city that rarely slept peacefully. You've just settled into that horsehair mattress, and as your eyes begin to flutter, let's drift deeper into one of Victorian London's most curious sleep aids, something that might surprise you, the humble practice of soaking toast in warm milk. Yes, toast in milk wasn't just a simple snack, it was a time-tested, go-to remedy for restless nights, whispered about in parlors and kitchens alike. You might think, toast and milk. Really, but for Victorians, this combination was comfort food and medicine rolled into one. Warm milk contains tryptophan, an amino acid that can help induce sleepiness, while toast adds a gentle carbohydrate boost that encourages the brain to use tryptophan more effectively. Together, they formed a mild soporific cocktail, far safer than the laudanum bottles crowding the bedside table. The practice was so popular that some Victorian sleep manuals gave precise instructions: toast bread until it was firm but not burned, break it into pieces, and soak it in warmed milk, sometimes with a dash of nutmeg, cinnamon, or even a spoonful of honey for sweetness. You might even catch a faint smell of nutmeg drifting through the air as you spoon the mixture, a spice once considered magical in its soothing qualities. This ritual wasn't just about the ingredients but the comfort of routine, the warm, creamy texture calming your throat and stomach, signaling your body that the day's work was done and it was time to relax. Some mothers swore by it for their children, believing it helped stave off nightmares and night terrors. Interestingly, historians still debate whether the effect was truly physiological or more psychological, the power of a soothing bedtime ritual itself, rather than the toast and milk combo, might have been the real secret. It's a reminder that sleep often depends as much on mindset as on biochemistry. You might imagine the kitchen glowing softly, a kettle simmering, a mother carefully preparing this nighttime snack, offering it with a gentle smile to a restless child or a weary spouse. It was the sort of small kindness that made the heavy, noisy city feel a little more like home. Some variations included a splash of ale or a pinch of hops infused in the milk, both known for their mild sedative effects. Though today that might sound like an odd bedtime drink, it was a common tweak, especially for adults battling insomnia or nervous exhaustion, a catch-all diagnosis for modern anxiety and stress. And if toast soaked in milk was a humble aid, Victorian doctors sometimes recommended much stranger concoctions: milk boiled with poppy heads, or infused with valerian root and other herbs. These potions were less about taste and more about delivering a punch of sedatives to the weary nervous system. Of course, the lower classes often couldn't afford such luxuries every night. Bread was rationed carefully, and milk wasn't always available or affordable. Still, for those who could, this simple remedy was a nightly ritual, a gentle bridge between the day's toil and the quiet darkness of sleep. So next time you're tempted to dismiss the old wives' tale of toast and milk, remember that for Victorians, it was a little nightly magic, an edible lullaby that whispered calm to the mind and body, even in the smoky gloom of London's restless nights. Now, imagine yourself drifting off after that warm milk and toast ritual, only to be disturbed, or perhaps comforted, by the sounds of the Victorian night. London after dark wasn't the quiet, peaceful place you might expect. It was a living, breathing organism, full of noises that shaped sleep, dreams, and fears alike. The city's nocturnal soundtrack was a mix of the natural and the mechanical. Horse hooves clattered on cobblestones, their rhythmic pounding sometimes lulling people to sleep, other times jolting them awake. Street vendors called out their wares late into the evening, from roasted chestnuts to newspapers, their cries cutting through the fog and gaslight haze. You might hear the distant clanging of factory bells or the rumble of early steam engines, signs that London's industrious heart never fully stopped beating, even when most were tucked away in bed. These industrial noises could be comforting or oppressive depending on your circumstances. Historians still argue how much the constant urban noise affected sleep quality, especially for the working class living near factories. Of course, the cries of children, the occasional dog's bark, and the clatter of footsteps echoed through narrow alleys. London was notoriously noisy at night, especially in the poorer districts where overcrowding was rampant, and walls were thin. The sounds were a constant reminder of life beyond your bedroom walls, sometimes easing loneliness, sometimes amplifying anxiety. Then there were the eerie noises, the howling wind slipping through cracked window panes, the creaks and groans of old timber houses settling in the cold, and the faint moans and groans attributed to restless spirits or the poor souls in London's vast underground. Superstition was strong, and many Victorians believed that the night was a time when spirits roamed more freely, bringing both comfort and fear. Gas lamps hissed and flickered, their erratic glow casting shadows that danced on the walls, sometimes playing tricks on tired eyes. The occasional sputtering flame or sudden extinguishing of a lamp was cause for whispered fears and hurried prayers. Some kept a spare candle or matches on the bedside table, ready to relight their sanctuary from darkness. For those living near the Thames, the river's nighttime presence was a constant, a low, rolling murmur, the splash of barges and the cries of night workers loading and unloading cargo. The smell of damp earth and the river's briny breath mingled with coal smoke, creating a thick, heavy atmosphere that seeped into bedrooms and dreams alike. And then there were the night watchmen, those figures patrolling the streets, calling out the hours or warning of fires and dangers. Their cries, though meant to protect, sometimes added to the restless night soundscape. In poorer neighborhoods, the watchman's call was a familiar, if not always comforting, presence. One curious tradition involved the nightingale's whistle, a high-pitched call imitated by some Londoners who believed it could soothe restless babies or warn against evil spirits. Whether a superstition or a genuine attempt at calm, it's another example of how sound was woven into the fabric of Victorian sleep. You might wonder if Victorians ever truly slept through the night. It was common for people to experience segmented sleep, waking for an hour or two in the middle of the night before falling back asleep. During this time, they might read, pray, or even visit neighbors. This pattern, historians argued, was normal for many pre-industrial societies, but urban noise and discomfort sometimes made returning to sleep more difficult. The omnipresent coal smoke added another layer to the sleep challenge. Smog could seep into bedrooms, making breathing difficult and sometimes leading to nighttime coughing fits. Victorian doctors linked the city's polluted air to poor health and restless nights, a concern that sparked early public health reforms. So as you lie in bed, surrounded by the clatter, creaks, and whispers of a London night, you're part of an ongoing story, a city that never truly sleeps, where the sounds of life and industry weave into the delicate tapestry of dreams and wakefulness. Now, with those restless sounds swirling around you, imagine the layers of clothing you might be wearing to bed. Victorian nightwear was a whole other experience, and quite different from your modern pajamas or t-shirt and shorts. The way Victorians dressed for sleep reflected their culture's complex relationship with modesty, comfort, and practicality. Most people didn't simply slip into soft cotton pajamas like you might today. Instead, the standard sleepwear was a long, loose nightshirt made of cotton or linen, sometimes flannel in colder months, that reached below the knees. The nightshirt was meant to keep you warm and preserve modesty, especially in households where families often shared bedrooms or even beds. The fabric was usually plain but sturdy, and sometimes starched to keep it crisp and clean, though this made it less comfortable and more prone to wrinkling. Some Victorian nightshirts featured delicate lace or embroidered trims for the wealthier classes, but for most, simplicity was the rule. And no elastic waistbands here, everything was loose and flowing, which could feel a little strange compared to the fitted comfort you're used to. Underneath, some wore thin cotton undergarments or drawers, especially men. Women might also layer with a chemise, a light underdress worn beneath nightgowns. Socks were common, since bedrooms were often drafty and floors cold. The combination was meant to keep the body warm without overheating, a delicate balance that Victorians understood all too well. One quirky fact, some Victorian sleepwear was scented. Yes, scented. It wasn't perfume per se, but rather lightly perfumed sachets or herbal infusions sewn into the fabric, often with lavender or rose petals, believed to promote relaxation and keep away insects like moths or fleas. Historians still debate how common this practice was and whether the scents really helped sleep or just added another layer of comfort. You might imagine the feeling of these long, flowing nightshirts brushing against your skin as you shift in bed, the fabric slightly rougher than today's soft cotton or silk but familiar and comforting. The nightshirt was a tactile cue that it was time to wind down, a simple, practical uniform for the nightly journey toward sleep. For children, bedtime attire varied. Some wore miniature versions of adult nightshirts, while others might be wrapped in swaddling cloths or blankets, especially infants. The idea of sleeping naked, which many modern adults find normal, was almost unheard of. Modesty and hygiene combined to make full coverage the norm. Interestingly, the wealthy sometimes slept in entirely different clothing from the poor. Their nightwear could be made from silk or fine cotton and decorated with embroidery or lace, making bedtime feel like a gentle luxury. But this extravagance didn't guarantee better sleep. Some aristocrats still struggled with insomnia and restless nights. And let's not forget about the collars. Victorian nightshirts often featured high collars, buttoned or laced up. You might find that a bit constricting compared to the freedom of a modern t-shirt, but it was standard for the time. Collars were meant to keep drafts away from the neck and upper chest, critical for health in chilly bedrooms. Some people added shawls or wraps before sleep, especially in winter, layering themselves in warmth. Hot water bottles were becoming popular, but they were still a novelty and not everyone had access to them. You might picture the care taken to keep warm despite the poor insulation and cold air seeping through window panes. Overall, Victorian nightwear was a mix of practicality, modesty, and a little touch of charm, sometimes perfumed, sometimes starched, always designed to protect you from the city's chilly nights and restless air. The clothing itself became part of the ritual, a gentle reminder that the day was over, and it was time to surrender to sleep. You're snug in your long nightshirt, and as your eyes begin to close, consider the role of light in Victorian sleep. London's nights were dim, yet not as dark as you might imagine. Gas lamps lined the streets, casting a soft, flickering glow that filtered through curtained windows, leaving a faint, amber-tinted haze in bedrooms. It wasn't quite daylight, but it wasn't pitch black either. This partial illumination had its quirks. Gas lighting was notoriously inconsistent, lamps could sputter, flicker, or suddenly go out, plunging rooms into near darkness or leaving ghostly shadows dancing on the walls. Many Victorian sleepers dealt with this unstable lightscape by keeping a candle or nightlight nearby. Flickering flames became an accepted part of the nocturnal ambience, as much as the creak of a floorboard or distant shout. The glow from street lamps seeped into bedrooms, sometimes so bright that it made it hard to fall asleep. Some residents, especially in wealthier homes, installed heavy drapes or shutters to block out the light. But poorer families had fewer options and were at the mercy of this nocturnal glow. Interestingly, historians still debate the impact of gas lighting on circadian rhythms. Did it disrupt natural sleep cycles, or did people simply adapt? We know today that even small amounts of artificial light can interfere with melatonin production and sleep quality, but Victorians lacked this understanding. They just coped as best they could, often embracing the warm, smoky light as part of their nighttime routine. Candles were common too, though more expensive and less safe. People often snuffed them out before bed, but sometimes left a candle burning through the night, especially if they feared intruders or darkness itself. Candle smoke added another layer of sensory experience, sometimes comforting, sometimes irritating to the lungs. For the very wealthy, bedrooms might have oil lamps or early forms of electric lighting later in the century, but these were rarities. The dim, flickering gaslight remained the dominant source for most Londoners well into the late 1800s. Another curious light-related practice involved darkening the bedroom windows during the day. People believed that exposure to too much daylight, especially bright sunshine, could disrupt the body's sleep-wake cycle. Blackout curtains or heavy drapes helped maintain a consistent, dim environment that signaled it was time for rest. On a stranger note, some Victorians believed that certain lights could ward off evil spirits. Blue-tinted glass lamps or lanterns were used for this purpose, especially near beds or doorways. Whether these were effective is, of course, part of folklore rather than science, but they reveal a fascinating link between light, sleep, and superstition. So as you drift closer to sleep, wrapped in layers of fabric and shadows, remember that the light around you is a flickering, fragile thing, part of the city's rhythm, part of your nightly lullaby, sometimes soothing, sometimes intrusive, but always there, shaping your experience of night. As the flicker of candlelight fades and shadows stretch across your nightshirt, your mind starts to wander toward the other half of the Victorian sleep story, dreams. Not just your own peculiar midnight mental theater, but what people in 19th century London thought dreams meant. Because in the age before sleep science, dreams weren't just random, they were omens, messages, or sometimes spiritual telegrams sent via the subconscious postal service. For many Victorians, dreams carried enormous weight. You didn't just dream about, say, a goose eating your hat and then move on. No, you consulted one of the many dream interpretation guides that lined shelves in London bookstalls. Dreamed of teeth falling out. That was bad, someone close to you might soon die. Found a coin in your sleep. Good fortune ahead. Kissing someone. Watch out for betrayal. Basically, your dreams came with homework. And there were so many of these books. Some were quasi-scientific, others were mystical, and a few were downright bonkers. One popular belief held that if you dreamt about snakes, someone was gossiping about you. And if you dreamt of your own death, that meant a long life ahead. Yes, Victorian logic was often a bit upside down. There were even printed dream almanacs sold in cheap editions at the corner tobacconist, right next to penny dreadfuls. Families sometimes shared them after breakfast, flipping through to decode their night's visions like they were solving a puzzle. Oh, you dreamt of drowning? HM. It says here that might mean a secret admirer, or tax trouble. Historians still argue whether these guides were more entertainment than belief system, but either way, they certainly influenced how people processed their dreams. Religious views also shaped dream interpretation. Some Christians in Victorian London saw dreams as messages from God, warnings, instructions, or signs of moral failing. Ministers sometimes referenced dreams in sermons, using them to caution against vanity or temptation. Meanwhile, spiritualists believed dreams could serve as a medium between this world and the next, allowing contact with the dead or insight into future events. And let's not forget the emergence of psychoanalysis near the end of the century. Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams didn't come out until 1899, but the idea that dreams were linked to hidden desires started to spread. A few radical thinkers in London's more academic circles began to wonder whether dreams were tied to trauma, repression, or even digestion. Yes, digestion. Because if you had that toast soaked in milk too late in the evening, and then dreamt of being chased by a flaming pig? Maybe it wasn't fate, maybe it was just indigestion. One fringe theory even suggested that dreams were the soul temporarily leaving the body, traveling to other realms. People who woke suddenly were warned not to move too fast, lest they disrupt the soul's return. It's a charmingly terrifying thought, that if you sat up too quickly, your soul might miss the landing window and get stuck in dreamland. You might imagine the scene, a mother gently waking her child, urging him not to rise too fast, whispering that his spirit needed a moment to return. Meanwhile, the child tries to shake off the tail end of a dream where he was a flying postman delivering letters to the moon. Victorian bedtime came with rules, and also with reverence. But despite all this interpretive weight, not every dream was analyzed. Many people simply saw dreams as the brain's nighttime mutterings, a bit strange, occasionally frightening, often hilarious. Dream sharing was a normal part of social life, especially among children and the elderly. People retold their dreams the way we share memes now, little flashes of absurdity that helped pass the morning or spice up an otherwise dull breakfast of porridge and dry toast. So, as you lie back now and feel your thoughts starting to blur at the edges, remember, in Victorian London, your dreams would not be your own private nonsense. They'd be examined, decoded, and, very likely, used as evidence that your cousin George was about to fall in love with a chimney sweep. Or that you needed to stop eating cheese before bed. You're adrift now, somewhere between dreams and waking, and perhaps your stomach gives a little grumble, a quiet reminder that even in the middle of the night, the body has its own ideas. For Victorians, the connection between food and sleep was taken very seriously. Some believed that what you ate, or didn't eat, could completely shape the quality of your rest, or even the contents of your dreams. Late-night snacking wasn't entirely taboo, but it was approached with suspicion. Medical advice columns in popular newspapers warned against heavy evening meals, claiming that a full stomach could lead to nightmares, indigestion, or a night of tossing and turning. In one particularly delightful example, an 1883 health manual blames dreams of thunderous beasts on a late supper of veal and kidney pie. So yes, Victorians definitely linked food to the nighttime monsters of the mind. The most recommended sleep aid? You already know, a slice of toast soaked in warm milk. This wasn't just a quaint tradition, it was practically a prescription. Doctors, housekeepers, and grandmothers alike endorsed it for calming the nerves, soothing the stomach, and encouraging genteel slumber. The starch of the bread and the gentle fats of the milk were thought to lull the body into a peaceful state. Of course, if you were lucky, or wealthy, you might have added a bit of cinnamon, honey, or even a shaving of nutmeg to this midnight elixir. Nutmeg was believed to aid digestion and relax the nerves, though too much could produce hallucinations. Historians still argue whether anyone ever actually hallucinated from a double-sprinkled mug of warm milk, or whether this was just another of those medical ghost stories that got passed around to spice up otherwise dull health advice. Poorer Londoners might substitute broth, or even beer, for milk if dairy was too expensive. A thin barley or oat gruel was another common late-night choice, sometimes served lukewarm, thickened slightly to stretch the ingredients. These were meals designed not to fill you up, but to gently convince your gut, and your mind, that it was okay to sleep. There were some more unusual food beliefs, too. Lettuce, oddly enough, was thought to be soporific, leading some people to sip boiled lettuce water before bed. It sounds ridiculous now, but imagine the scene, a yawning Victorian teen, bleary-eyed, sipping cabbagey tea from a chipped mug while his mother insists it'll keep the demons out. Fringe science? Absolutely. But it shows just how deeply connected food and sleep were in the public imagination. And let's not forget the idea of bad food dreams. Victorian guides warned that eating rich or spicy foods before bed, like curries, pork pies, or preserved eels, could lead to sleep disturbed by confusing or terrifying visions. These weren't just personal experiences, they became part of the cultural dialogue. People knew that too much cheese led to dreams of drowning, or that pickled onions could conjure apparitions. Whether it was superstition or a very early form of sleep hygiene, food had moral weight after sundown. Some people even believed that eating nothing at all could be dangerous, that going to bed on an empty stomach might cause your body to turn against itself, resulting in restless limbs or panicked waking. Others claimed that it could invite possession by night spirits, who were said to prey more easily on the hungry and weak. Again, the line between folklore and science was beautifully, confusingly thin. Then there were the bedtime drinks. Milk was king, but there were also mild alesh, small beers, a diluted brew with low alcohol content, and herbal teas. Chamomile was popular, as was valerian root, though many found its strong, earthy taste off-putting. A brave few sipped opiate-laced tonics or patent medicines containing laudanum or morphine. These were dangerous, addictive, and heavily marketed, promising a perfect night's rest with the gentle side effect of maybe forgetting who you were for a while. It was a sleepy, sip-heavy culture. You didn't just stumble into bed, you prepared. You drank, you nibbled, you bundled yourself against the cold. The body and the mind were eased into slumber like actors getting ready to step off stage. So tonight, as your body grows still and warm beneath the covers, you're not so different from that Victorian sleeper, spooning up lukewarm milquetoast or sipping weird salad water in hopes of drifting off. Our cravings and fears at bedtime haven't changed all that much. We still want the same thing, a quiet body, a quiet mind, and a gentle landing into dreams. You're full now, of toast, milk, maybe even a little boiled lettuce water if you're feeling adventurous, and your thoughts begin to ebb like the tide along the Thames. But before your mind fully lets go, it curls around one more layer of bedtime tradition, the rituals. Because in Victorian London, falling asleep wasn't just something that happened. It was something you did, with steps, structure, and sometimes, a little theater. Let's start with one of the most common nightly customs, the reading of moral tales. Families often gathered in dimly lit parlors or bedrooms for a few chapters of something both virtuous and soothing. Maybe it was Pilgrim's Progress, or the history of Sandford and Merton, texts stuffed with obedience, temperance, and the occasional thrilling moral downfall. For children, fairy tales were allowed, but not the fun kind. The Brothers Grimm were often sanitized, their darker endings softened or omitted entirely. You wouldn't want little Arthur dreaming about eyeball-plucking crows before church, after all. One fringe practice involved whispering affirmations or prayers directly into a child's ear while they slept, believing the words would nest in the subconscious and produce more obedient behavior the next day. Historians still debate whether this was a spiritual act or just a sneaky parenting hack, but imagine your mum leaning in at midnight to murmur, "You will tidy the hearth without complaint." Adults, too, followed rituals, brushing hair exactly 100 strokes, folding clothing with geometric precision, reciting prayers aloud or silently. For women, there might be cold cream for the face, or rosewater for the hands. A servant might knock gently to bring up the warming pan, its coals tucked inside to slide between the sheets and chase away the cold damp of London walls. Some households followed the slightly eerie practice of turning mirrors to face the wall. It was thought that mirrors could trap a soul mid-dream, or reflect the spirit world during sleep. Whether protective or purely superstitious, it added an extra hush to the room. You wouldn't want to catch your own reflection at night, they said, it might not be just you looking back. Let's not forget the ritual of the nightcap, yes, the actual cap. These weren't just a Dr. Seuss flourish. Nightcaps were considered essential for keeping warm, especially in homes where heating was a luxury. Women's caps were often ruffled and tied with ribbon, men's were pointed or drooped to the side like sleepy birthday hats. Wearing one was believed to guard the mind against chills, and possibly against stray, wandering thoughts. And then there were the bedtime charms. A small sachet of lavender tucked into the pillowcase. A silver spoon laid under the mattress for protection. A bit of rosemary at the windowsill to keep away illness. Fringe? Sure. But not uncommon. Victorian Londoners took no chances when it came to sleep. It was precious, elusive, and constantly under threat from noise, hunger, sickness, or the spirits of the air. In some households, the final ritual was silence itself. Once prayers were said, beds warmed, and candles snuffed, the room settled into an almost sacred quiet. Even the ticking of the clock seemed louder. No more talking. No more bustling. Just stillness, save for the creak of floorboards and the slow settling of the building. You lay in bed, eyes wide open in the dark, listening to your own breathing and wondering if that thump downstairs was just the cat, or something else. For children, bedtime might involve being told not to dream, or rather, not to share them. Some adults believed dreams were private, and that discussing them might invite envy or misfortune. Others used bedtime stories as reverse lullabies, cautionary tales about those who didn't sleep, ghosts, witches, thieves. You learned to fall asleep with your back to the wall, just in case. Some of these customs faded by morning, forgotten like mist. But others stuck, becoming lifelong habits, passed down through generations. Today, you might still plump your pillow just so, or sip something warm, or straighten your room as if your grandmother were about to inspect it. That's the lingering pull of these small, inherited ceremonies. So tonight, As your own body settles into quiet repetition, phone down, lights low, blanket tugged just right, you're part of a long, strange tradition. A ritual of letting go. A delicate dance between your waking self and whatever's waiting on the other side of sleep. You're warm now, settled in, your breath beginning to slow as the hours deepen. And in that liminal space, between the last blink and the first dream, you might start to feel something else stirring, the night itself. Because for Victorians, night was more than just the absence of day. It had a presence, a character. And it was filled with things that didn't belong in daylight. You see, night in Victorian London came with a personality. It was whispered about, watched closely, and often feared. It was when the air shifted, cooler, yes, but also heavier. Sounds carried differently. The clip of hooves echoed sharper. Pipes groaned more mournfully. And the street lamps, those flickering gaslit guardians, cast long shadows that made even the most innocent shapes look like they were plotting something. People who could afford it shut their doors tight against the night. Shutters were drawn. Bolts slid into place. Some families even stuffed rags in window cracks to keep out the damp and, so they hoped, whatever else drifted in with it. Historians still argue whether this was just practical insulation or a reflection of a deeper superstition, that night air could carry disease, or worse, bad dreams. For poorer households, the night was less sealed off. Cracks in the walls let the cold, and the sounds, creep in. A shout from down the alley. A scuffle. A distant baby crying, or someone softly singing to keep themselves company. In shared lodging houses, sleep came in shifts, often interrupted. You might drift off only to be jostled awake by a stranger needing the same straw pallet. The darkness didn't promise peace, it demanded resilience. Night was also when the rules changed. During the day, society's norms kept things orderly. But at night, well, let's just say there were more rats than gentlemen roaming the streets. Certain professions only truly began at sundown: watchmen, chimney sweeps starting early, night soil collectors, streetwalkers, and yes, the occasional amateur ghost hunter. If you ever wanted to see how thin the veil was between London's working classes and its supernatural fears, all you had to do was go for a walk at 2 a.m. It was also when the supernatural got its strongest grip. Victorians didn't just fear burglars or illness, they feared what couldn't be explained. The concept of the witching hour, often placed between 3 and 4 a.m., had a firm hold on the public imagination. Ghosts were believed to be most active then, slipping through old keyholes, making cold spots in attics, whispering just loudly enough to disturb your rest. You'd hear stories of people waking up with a weight on their chest, unable to move. Today, we'd call it sleep paralysis. Back then, it was a visit from the bold hag, a malevolent spirit said to sit on sleepers and steal their breath. Children were told to sleep on their sides to avoid her. Adults, too, might keep iron near the bed, just in case. Other nighttime entities included fetches, ghostly doubles of still-living people. Seeing a fetch in the night was believed to be a death omen. Then there were banshees, black dogs, and the ever-popular Victorian favorite, shadow men. Were they ghosts? Hallucinations? Nightmares halfway remembered? No one agreed. But everyone had a story. Even sound took on a kind of sentience. The ticking of a clock. The distant toll of Big Ben. Footsteps that stopped just before your door, then didn't start again. A creak that somehow happened upstairs, when no one lived above you. All of it combined to make the night something more than a time of day. It was a personality. A mood. A realm. Of course, not everyone was afraid. Some embraced the mystery. Night walks were a quiet subculture of their own, solitary wanderers or poetic types who claimed they could think better in the dark. Charles Dickens himself was known to walk London by night, observing the city as it shifted into its stranger self. He once walked 12 miles after midnight, just to clear the mind. But even these brave souls respected the rules of night. You didn't whistle after dark, it was thought to summon spirits. You didn't leave your boots pointing toward the bed, it could invite restless dreams. And you certainly didn't speak aloud any invitation to visit, even jokingly, while near a graveyard. That was just asking for trouble. So now, as your room softens into true darkness, and the last of the light fades behind your eyelids, you're wrapped in something very old. A shared understanding that night isn't just the absence of day. It's its own creature. And as long as you're under covers, tucked in tight, and maybe keeping a bit of iron on the nightstand, well, you should be just fine. The hours deepen, and you feel yourself floating, gently, lazily, on the edge of sleep. But for Victorians, even dreaming came with its own tangled web of meaning. You didn't just sleep. You traveled. You visited. Dreams weren't passive, they were portals. And what happened in them was never just nonsense. It was often taken quite seriously. You stir in your bed in 1880s London, tucked under a heavy blanket, soothed by warm milk and muffled street noise. And then it begins. A strange dream. Maybe you're flying over the Thames, or being chased by an angry butcher wielding a turnip. Whatever it is, you'll be expected to remember it. Because Victorians loved dreams. They feared them, interpreted them, and tried to manipulate them with a fervor that makes modern dream journals look positively minimalist. Dream interpretation was practically a national pastime. Entire manuals, some religious, some delightfully unhinged, explained what various dream symbols meant. Dreaming of teeth falling out. Bad omen. Seeing a white horse. Good luck. Falling from a height. You're too proud. Being naked in public. You're harboring shame or, worse, secret radical thoughts. Historians still argue whether these meanings were widely accepted or more like dinner party games, but some people certainly lived by them. One account from 1867 describes a woman who cancelled her engagement after dreaming her fiancé had a third ear. She took it as a divine warning, he would never listen to her. You could buy dream dictionaries from stationers or street vendors. Many families kept one by the bedside, right next to the Bible. Some even cut out clippings from newspapers that included Dream of the Week horoscopes. It wasn't just folklore, it was part of the everyday rhythm of life. You dreamed. You remembered. You looked it up. But dreams weren't just omens, they were considered communication. Spiritualists believed dreams were messages from the dead. A dearly departed grandmother might whisper warnings about future illness. A lost child might appear in a golden field, reaching for your hand. These weren't interpreted metaphorically, they were accepted, quite literally, as nightly visits from beyond the veil. That's why many people began to keep dream journals. The idea was simple, record everything. First thing upon waking, no matter how foggy or bizarre. A cup of cold tea often sat nearby to help the sleeper stay alert enough to write before the dream faded into the morning air. And what got recorded? The surreal and the mundane, was chased by geese again. Fell into a well, smelled of jam. Saw mother. She smiled, then vanished. There was also an entire class of dream-induced remedies. If you dreamed of water, you might be told to increase your spiritual practices. If you dreamed of fire, someone might suggest a tonic for the liver. One fringe pamphlet even claimed that dream content could predict fertility, proposing that green apples and snow in dreams foretold twins. Dubious science. Oh, absolutely. But deeply believed by many. The fascination went even further. Victorian inventors began experimenting with ways to induce or control dreams. One 1870s prototype for a dream helmet involved scented oils released in a timed fashion near the nose during REM cycles. The idea? Trigger specific dream types, romance, fortune, travel, based on smell. It never caught on, possibly because many testers simply woke up confused and slightly sticky. Lucid dreaming, while not called that by name, had a quiet cult following. Some believed that by repeating certain phrases before sleep, such as, "I will know I am dreaming," you could enter your dreams consciously. The goal? Communicate with the dead, confront fears, or just enjoy flying over chimneys and gas lamps with the poise of a Victorian Superman. Of course, not everyone welcomed dreams. Nightmares, especially recurring ones, were seen as either medical issues or moral warnings. Clergy often advised parishioners to confess unspoken sins if they were being troubled in the night. Others turned to medicine, chloroform, laudanum, or sleep tonics designed to knock the dream out of you entirely. It was the ultimate Victorian contradiction: dreams were sacred. Unless they were annoying, at which point you drugged them into silence. There was also anxiety about waking dreams, those hazy states where you couldn't quite tell if you were asleep or not. Often confused with hallucinations, these experiences sparked fears of madness or demonic possession. If someone began speaking to unseen visitors in their sleep, it might be interpreted as prophecy, or a one-way ticket to the asylum. Even artists and writers mined their dreams for inspiration. Many poems and short stories began as bizarre nighttime visions. A well-documented case includes a minor poet from Hackney who claimed his most famous verse, "Upon the fog and fiddle," came to him in a dream delivered by a ghostly fox. The poem was terrible, but the anecdote gained traction. And now, here you are. Maybe you'll dream tonight. Maybe you already are. A street filled with whispers. A pie that talks. A room with no ceiling. And tomorrow, if you lived back then, you'd wake up and turn to page 47 of your dream dictionary, finger trailing down until you found, "Talking pies," foretells unexpected news. Sleep is never just sleep in Victorian London. It's a message, a mirror, a haunting, a hope. And as you drift further into that strange and shifting world, maybe, just maybe, you'll leave the door open for a visitor or two. You're drifting now, deep into that rich, weightless place where thought softens and form dissolves. But just as you begin to slip under, let's linger a little longer with one last oddity: those who made sleep their life's business. Because in Victorian London, there were entire professions, industries, and hobbyists devoted to sleep, not just their own, but yours too. Let's begin with the bedmakers, not the ones fluffing your pillow at a five-star hotel, but the true craftsmen who built beds by hand. In London's East End, entire workshops were dedicated to constructing bed frames from pine, mahogany, or iron, often engraved or twisted into delicate flourishes. A proper bed was a symbol of prosperity. But even among the poor, there was pride in a well-made cot, even if it sat in a shared room with 6 snoring strangers. Some beds were extravagant. The more money you had, the more you could sink into comfort: padded headboards, canopies of lace, even mechanical parts. One eccentric baronet famously commissioned a self-rocking sleep cradle, large enough for an adult man. It gently swayed him all night using a series of pulleys, clock springs, and one very patient housemaid. Historians still argue whether it actually worked or just made his guests dizzy when they tried it. Beyond beds, you had mattress stuffers and bolster fillers. Feather, straw, horsehair, or even wool, each had its devotees. Feather was most prized, but also the most expensive. Lower-class families might sleep on sacks of straw or rags, rearranged nightly to avoid sore spots. There was even a brief craze for water pillows, bladders filled with cold water, meant to soothe insomnia. One reviewer said they worked wonders, until the cat bit his. Then came the sellers of sleep aids, the Victorian equivalent of your local wellness influencer. Apothecaries stocked rows of soporific potions, laudanum, opium tinctures, chloral hydrate, valerian root. For those with cash and no pressing need to wake up early, a few drops of something narcotic could knock you out cold. These were legally sold and wildly popular, especially among stressed-out poets and women with hysteria, which, as we now know, basically meant, has a personality. Some remedies took a more theatrical approach. Sleep masks weren't yet fashionable, but sleep veils were, a lacy curtain tied gently over the face, said to protect your eyes from moonlight and ward off sleep demons. There were also ear trumpets stuffed with cotton, and insomnia gloves, which claimed to calm the nerves if worn overnight. Spoiler, they were just gloves. Then there were the sleep educators. Yes, really. Individuals who claimed expertise in the art of slumber. They wrote pamphlets, gave lectures, and even offered house calls. One man, known only as Dr. Penworthy, charged 5 shillings to come into your home, observe your bedtime routine, and then tell you everything you were doing wrong. He was known to scold people for drinking tea past 4 p.m., sleeping with their toes too high, or facing the wrong cardinal direction. A bit much? Absolutely. But he had clients. And let's not forget the alarm clock inventors, those unsung engineers who made it their mission to wake you up on time. The earliest mechanical alarm clocks were notoriously unreliable. They ticked too loudly, rang at random, or simply refused to stop. One patent from 1874 describes a clock that dumped a cup of water onto the sleeper's head. It sold 3 units. Another concept involved a miniature bell ringer with tiny brass arms, programmed to tap a symbol next to your ear. This one made it all the way to Harrods, before being quietly retired after an unfortunate incident involving startled bladder control. Children's sleep was a booming market, too. Nannies were trained in bedtime protocol, rocking techniques, and lullaby selection. Wealthy families sometimes hired night nurses whose sole task was to sit beside the crib all night, in case the baby stirred. These jobs were coveted, and occasionally terrifying, especially when a child began talking in their sleep. One documented account involves a nanny who claimed a toddler recited the Lord's Prayer backward in his sleep. She quit the next morning. The literature around sleep also exploded. Novels, poems, and plays explored the mystery of unconsciousness. Some treated sleep as sacred. Others as sinister. You'd find books with titles like The Shadow of Sleep or Whispers from the Pillow. The line between dream and death was so thin, it became poetic shorthand. He passed into slumber was often a gentler way of saying someone had died. Of course, for every professional sleep booster, there were the skeptics. Critics in the medical press argued that sleep fads were dangerous distractions. They mocked dream interpreters, denounced laudanum as a crutch, and warned against oversleeping lest one become sluggish, melancholic, or, God forbid, French. One physician even published a piece titled Sleep, the Slow Drowning, which wasn't exactly bedtime reading. But whether you believed in science, spirits, or just the power of a good mattress, one thing was clear: Victorians took sleep seriously. It wasn't just a biological need, it was an event. A performance. A battleground. And in a city that never truly quieted, where the gaslights burned into the early morning and factory whistles pierced the dawn, you had to fight for your rest. So tonight, as your limbs melt deeper into your mattress, think of all those strange little people and stranger inventions, all aimed at helping someone, somewhere, finally fall asleep. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes they flooded the bed. Either way, it's comforting to know that sleep, messy, sacred, and hilariously overcomplicated, has always been worth chasing. Now you're nearly there, just a few heavy blinks from slipping into your own dream parade. But let's hover a bit longer in the gaslamp half-light of Victorian London, because some of the strangest ideas about sleep weren't about what you did while resting, but what could go wrong if you didn't sleep properly. You see, Victorians feared sleeplessness like modern folks fear missed deadlines or bad Wi-Fi. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. It could unravel your health, your mind, even your soul. Entire medical journals warned of what they called sleep depletion, a term that sounds mild until you read their descriptions: headaches, emotional instability, melancholic fugues, spontaneous weeping during dinner, and, occasionally, death. You'd think they were describing a Victorian Monday. Insomnia, as it was more formally labeled, became a social concern by the late 1800s. If someone in your boarding house wasn't sleeping, you'd probably hear about it. They might wander the halls muttering poetry. Or they'd show up to breakfast glassy-eyed, spooning porridge with the urgency of a ghost. Friends might whisper, "He's not been sleeping, you know," as though it were a terminal illness. And doctors had theories, so many theories. Maybe your bed was too firm. Or your curtains too thin. Or your thoughts too sinful. One popular diagnosis was mental overstimulation, which could be caused by, among other things, excessive piano playing, novel reading, or exposure to bright colors. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were truly medical or more of a cultural scolding, but the result was always the same: you were given strict rules for sleep hygiene long before that became a TikTok hashtag. Victorian sleep hygiene meant more than brushing your teeth and avoiding screens, obviously. You were instructed to air the room daily, wear fresh linen, avoid shellfish before bed, and say your prayers in a calm, measured voice. One popular household guide insisted that a clergyman should not prepare his sermons in the bedroom, lest the bed become morally burdened. Which is honestly just excellent advice. For chronic insomniacs, things got experimental. There were sleep cages, yes, little canopied enclosures designed to eliminate all light and noise. Some looked like mosquito nets. Others resembled what you'd get if you asked a blacksmith to build a tent. They were supposed to reduce mental chatter by simulating the womb. Instead, they mostly gave people the creeps. If that didn't work, there were the more aggressive methods: cupping, bloodletting, and cold baths. Doctors might recommend a plunge into icy water at 5 a.m. to shock the nervous system into submission. Did it work? Not really. Did it get you out of bed? Definitely. One woman wrote in her diary, "I would rather remain mad with insomnia than endure another bath in the devil's tub." Then came the rise of hypnotism. Yes, hypnotism. It wasn't just for parlor tricks. Many Victorians saw it as a legitimate medical tool. Sleep doctors, some with actual degrees, some with mustaches and ambition, would attempt to repattern the restless mind using gentle suggestion. The subject would be coaxed into a trance while the hypnotist murmured phrases like, "Your eyelids are like velvet drapes," or "Sleep will cradle you as a mother does." Sounds cozy, until you remember this was happening in rooms lit by flickering gas jets while an onlooker took notes in Latin. There were even public sleep trials, demonstrations in which patients were put to sleep under observation, sometimes in theaters, sometimes in hospitals. Crowds would gather, and murmurs would rise if the subject slumped too quickly. It became a kind of sport: who would nod off fastest? Who would twitch? Who would mutter secrets? But underneath all this spectacle was a deep, gnawing anxiety: what if you never slept again? You see, Victorians feared what sleeplessness might do to the mind. Madness and sleep deprivation were intimately linked in popular thinking. Asylums often logged patient sleep hours with more scrutiny than their diets. If someone began hallucinating, the first question was, have they slept? And if not, well, better prepare the restraints. Even authors got in on the horror. Gothic fiction is packed with insomniacs. From pale poets to haunted governesses, sleeplessness was portrayed as the first sign of a crumbling psyche. One particularly melodramatic serial in the Penny Dreadful featured a character who stayed awake for 20 days, during which time he solved a murder, spoke with ghosts, and then promptly expired in a rose garden. All of this panic led to an ironic result: the more you feared insomnia, the worse it got. Modern experts call this anticipatory anxiety, but back then, it was simply called the sleep curse. People believed that once you started fearing your own bed, it could turn against you. Sheets. Would feel wrong. Pillows too loud. One woman even claimed her feather mattress hummed with spite. To fight this curse, Victorians turned to the oddest rituals. Some believed placing lavender under the tongue calmed restless dreams. Others swore by sleeping on the floor on alternating Tuesdays. One man wrote to a newspaper suggesting that counting backward from 1000 while imagining sheep made of brass would reset the brain. No one tried it, presumably because it sounds like math punishment. And if all else failed, you got up. You walked. Victorian London was filled with nightwalkers, insomniacs bundled in shawls and coats, roaming the city in slow circles. Some chatted softly in parks. Others stared into shop windows, watching their own blurry reflections stare back. There's a quiet kind of peace in that, a sleepless city of people trying, each in their own odd way, to coax themselves towards stillness. So if you've ever tossed and turned, frustrated and fuzzy, know this, you're in good company. Across the centuries, people have battled their own stubborn brains. They've tried feathers and formulas, veils and vapors. And in the end, most of them got there, eventually. Maybe you already have. You're nearly weightless now, adrift on the tide of this strange, sleepy history. But before you fully surrender to the pull of your pillow, let's visit the most universal and intimate feature of Victorian sleep, the dream itself. Because once the gas lamps dimmed and the thick city night settled in, dreams were the place where everything, fears, hopes, suppressed emotions, found their voice. For the Victorians, dreams weren't just the brain's white noise, they were messages, symbols, sometimes even warnings. And some people spent entire lifetimes trying to decode them. You stir under your covers, and imagine yourself lying in a narrow London bed, maybe in Bloomsbury or Whitechapel, the ceiling stained slightly yellow with years of smoke. Outside, hooves clack along cobbles. Inside, you begin to drift, and in the Victorian mind, that moment, that liminal transition between waking and sleep, was sacred. It was known as the veil, the thinnest boundary between the mortal and mystical world. And once you passed through it, dreams poured in. And dreams mattered. Victorian dream interpretation became a popular obsession. Middle-class women especially clung to thick volumes like the Illustrated Oneirocriticon or Madame Lamarchand's Universal Dream Guide, which listed hundreds of symbols with neat meanings. Dreaming of a fish? That meant money. A closed door. Secrets. A snake wrapped in ivy. Temptation, of course. And an umbrella, always an umbrella, meant a wedding. Even more curious were the shared beliefs in prophetic dreams. People claimed that their nightly visions had predicted pregnancies, deaths, house fires, and financial windfalls. A particularly famous case involved a merchant's daughter who dreamed her father would be robbed by a tall man with dirty sleeves. The next week, a pickpocket matching that exact description lifted his coin purse near Piccadilly. Coincidence? Historians still argue whether stories like these were reported truthfully or embellished to suit an audience hungry for mystery. Dreams were also a canvas for the unspoken. In a society with strict codes of behavior, especially for women, dreams offered a back door for the forbidden. In these private night plays, people kissed forbidden lovers, argued with the dead, or wandered streets in unfamiliar cities. They dreamed of flying, of falling, of running too slowly, all those classic tropes that haven't changed in centuries. And they did it all without guilt, because after all, it was only a dream. For artists and writers, dreams were raw material. Poets like Coleridge and Rossetti mined their dreams for metaphors and rhythms. Painters tried to depict dream states with soft edges, surreal settings, or symbolic objects. Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, famously dreamlike, was written in this era and captured the Victorian fascination with unconscious absurdity. One critic wrote, "It is not a children's tale, but a map of the restless Victorian soul." Accurate and unsettling. But dreams weren't always beautiful. Nightmares carried their own symbolic weight. Some were believed to come from indigestion, the devils of cheese, as one pamphlet warned. Others were said to be moral warnings or signs of spiritual disturbance. Sleepers might wake in terror after dreaming of fire, drowning, or being chased by figures in black. Some even experienced what we now know as sleep paralysis, but back then was called being hag-ridden, a state in which the sleeper felt awake but trapped, with a crushing weight on the chest. The night hag was a terrifying folk figure, described as a shadowy woman who sat on your chest, stole your breath, and whispered secrets into your ears. She was blamed for countless sleep disruptions, especially in rural districts. Whole families would sleep with garlic or ash under their pillows to keep her away. Of course, modern medicine explains these experiences differently, but try telling that to someone frozen in bed while a shadow looms at the foot of it. Still, not all dream figures were frightening. Some Victorians claimed to be visited regularly by kind spirits, dead relatives, or helpful angels who whispered advice. These dreams were cherished and even written down in thick, dream diaries, complete with dates, interpretations, and emotional reactions. A few of these diaries survive today, filled with pencil sketches of dream landscapes, scrawled captions like, "Danced with mother in a garden of clocks," and occasional tea stains. Of course, not everyone took dreams seriously. The hard-nosed rationalists, the scientists and skeptics of the age, dismissed dreams as random firings of the brain. One neurologist declared that, a dream is but a jumbled scrapbook of recent inputs, which, admittedly, sounds like half the internet. But the public mostly ignored him, because honestly, where's the romance in that? Dream control, or lucid dreaming, was also beginning to intrigue the curious. A handful of Victorian thinkers kept logs of their attempts to become aware during dreams. Some claimed to have succeeded, even flying through imagined cities or conducting conversations with dream-generated strangers. One eccentric, an inventor named Charles Billings, claimed he learned to play the violin in his sleep, though no one could confirm if he was any good at it awake. And as always, sleep-selling entrepreneurs tried to get in on the action. There were dream pillows stuffed with herbs like mugwort and chamomile, sold with promises like, "Inspire the astral self." There were tinctures labeled Oniro, or night essence, meant to deepen dreams. And of course, there were those ever-present spiritualists, ready to interpret your visions, for a fee. In the end, dreaming was yet another frontier the Victorians tried to chart, like electricity or phrenology or the inside of the earth. They mapped it with poetry, medicine, superstition, and the occasional fraud. But unlike most other mysteries, dreams refused to be conquered. They remained, as they still are, both intimate and unknowable. Soft flashes of meaning. A little theater behind your eyes. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the magic of dreams isn't in what they mean, but that they happen at all. So as your own dreams start to gather, shapes forming behind your eyelids, whispers echoing in your inner dark, just remember, this, too, is history. A living, breathing tradition of drifting minds, reaching towards something beyond waking. Close your eyes. Breathe. You're almost there. By now, you're barely tethered to the waking world, just a thread of thought away from drifting entirely. But hold on a little longer, because we still have one last, surprisingly personal stop to make in this long, sleepy walk through Victorian slumber, the final rituals of the night. Not for everyone. Just for the wealthy. You see, if you were rich in Victorian London, really rich, you didn't just go to bed. You arrived at sleep like royalty returns to a palace. And your journey there was a well-rehearsed performance, with props, attendants, and multiple costume changes. It began with the dressing gown. Not the scratchy bathrobes you may be picturing, but luxurious, embroidered garments that made you look like you were hosting a moonlit dinner party in a Turkish opium den. Men wore velvet robes with quilted lapels, often deep burgundy or forest green. Women had flowing wraps of silk and lace, layered like you were preparing to be admired in a boudoir painting. You didn't just sleep, you reclined. Next came the ablutions. A full nighttime cleansing was essential, and if you were lucky enough to live in a house with running water, and not just a jug and basin, you might soak in a warm bath lightly scented with lavender or neroli. For others, it was sponge downs and foot baths by the fireplace. Servants might heat towels on iron racks, then bring them folded with tongs like offerings. Cleanliness was more than a luxury, it was a status symbol. It signified that you had both time and help. Working-class folks, by contrast, often went to bed still wearing remnants of their day. But in Belgravia or Mayfair, no one would be caught unconscious without at least 3 layers of flannel and pride. To suit the mind, some upper-class households employed nighttime readers. Yes, actual people who read aloud while you lay in bed. Usually a governess, a younger sister, or an underpaid niece. The books? Nothing too stimulating. Light essays, religious devotions, or sentimental verse, nothing that would encourage wild dreams or, heaven forbid, opinions. Historians still argue whether this tradition was about companionship or control. Possibly both. Then, of course, came the final bedroom inspection. A lady's maid or valet would check the bed's warmth, often with a bed-warming pan filled with hot coals, slid between the sheets and removed before you climbed in. The mattress would be fluffed, the pillow lightly beaten. Some beds even had thermometers to measure if the room was the optimal resting climate. Which sounds dramatic, until you remember that central heating didn't exist and some bedrooms hit temperatures best described as meat storage. The lighting was adjusted, gas lamps turned down low, curtains drawn in double layers. You might burn a sleep candle, slow-melting wax designed to extinguish itself after precisely 2 hours. You know, in case your dreams needed a built-in timer. And then, the last ritual, the bedside drink. For the elite, this wasn't just any beverage. We're talking silver trays with delicate cups of warm milk, sometimes infused with rose water, or a thimble of port, or barley water spiced with nutmeg. There was even a fad for drinking warmed, sleep cordial, a blend of honey, poppy syrup, and violet essence. Sweet, floral, vaguely medicinal. Like drinking a garden that had read too much poetry. Some went even further. Gentlemen might keep a small brandy flask hidden in the drawer, for the nerves. A few ladies developed late-night sherry habits that no one discussed openly. And yes, occasionally, the line between a sleep tonic and a full-blown opiate cocktail was blurred, especially when it came in a cut-glass bottle labeled, for restful dreams. Then, and only then, could you slip into bed, carefully. Victorian beds were elaborate things. 4 posters with thick curtains, mattresses stuffed with horsehair or down, and enough embroidered linen to smother a horse. Climbing in wasn't so much casual as choreographed. You might even have a small step stool if the bed sat particularly high, which many did because drafts were considered deadly. Once in bed, you arranged yourself properly. No sprawling or tucking one arm under the pillow. You lay flat, facing slightly left, arms by your side, because apparently that was the approved, digestive position. Deviate from it and you might as well expect nightmares and social ruin. And then, finally, you closed your eyes, knowing that you'd done everything the upper class was supposed to do to summon perfect, noble sleep. Of course, this didn't guarantee anything. Many of the rich were just as plagued by restlessness and midnight worries as their poorer counterparts. But the rituals helped. Not necessarily because they worked, but because they offered control, over a thing that, by nature, defies control. And maybe that's the lesson buried in all this luxury. Whether you were a duke with a feather mattress or a seamstress curled near the hearth, sleep came when it came. The rituals, lavish or humble, were little more than spells we cast over ourselves. Magic made of warm milk, flickering light, and belief. So, as you sink deeper now, you might imagine yourself lying in one of those cavernous Victorian beds. Lace curtain drawn. A fire whispering in the grate. A distant church bell tolling once, maybe twice. Outside, the city sighs and curls into itself. Inside, you are still. You have everything you need. Clean linens. A soft breeze. A story well told. And sleep, well, it's waiting. The final stretch now. You're on the edge of sleep, but let's drift just a little further, into the quiet after the lights go out. Because sleep in Victorian London wasn't just about lying down and closing your eyes, it was about the sounds and smells and the hum of life winding down all around you. You might hear the steady creak of wooden floorboards in neighboring rooms, the occasional cough from a restless child, or the low murmur of a distant street vendor packing up shop. The gas lamps flicker softly, casting shadows that dance like old ghosts along peeling wallpaper. Outside, the city exhales, a horse snorts, a carriage rolls past, a dog barks once and then all is still. Many slept with their windows open, despite the chill. It was the fresh air that counted, more than warmth or silence. A little cold was better than the stifling, smoky rooms full of coal fumes. Some neighborhoods, especially in poorer districts, were thick with fog and soot, which hung like a curtain between the street and the bed. It gave the night a dreamlike quality, and for some, the fog itself was a comfort, a natural blanket that muted the chaos. Sleep wasn't just a private matter either. Large families, cramped apartments, and shared beds meant that you were always aware of others settling in nearby. The rising and falling of breath, the rustle of fabric, the occasional whispered prayer, it was a collective rhythm. You weren't alone in sleep. The city itself seemed to sleep with you, breathing in sync. And then there were the nightly sounds that modern London can't quite capture. The distant whistle of trains crossing the Thames, the clang of factory gates shutting down, the faint notes of a street musician's last tune fading into the night. These became part of the city's lullaby. But not all was peaceful. The ever-present fear of fire, one of the greatest dangers in the densely packed city, hovered even in sleep. A sudden shout, a bell ringing, and families were jolted awake, hearts pounding, rushing to douse flames or escape through narrow alleys. Historians still argue whether the threat of nightly disaster made Victorians sleep lighter or just more resigned. Yet despite all this, or maybe because of it, the Victorian night had a strange kind of serenity. It was a pause, a moment where the relentless pace of the day fell away. Where the mind could rest, and the body recharge. And as you finally slip past the threshold, you become part of that age-old tradition, the hush that falls over a city, the peaceful surrender to sleep's gentle tide. So breathe deeply now. Feel the soft pull of dreams gathering. The night is vast, and you are safe. Your story, this story, blends into the quiet. Good night, and sweet dreams. Wind down. Now, as the last echoes of Victorian London's restless night fade softly behind your eyelids, let your thoughts slow. Picture the lamplight dimming, the streets hushed beneath a thick, comforting fog. Imagine the quiet warmth of a well-worn bed, the faint scent of lavender or toast soaked in warm milk lingering in the air. There's no rush here. No noise but the gentle rhythm of your own breath, the peaceful pulse of sleep's arrival. Let the edges of the day soften and blur, like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. You are safe. You are calm. The world, with all its weight and wonder, pauses with you. Sleep is not just a need, but a gift, an ancient, whispered promise that no matter how chaotic the day, the night will bring rest. And you, wherever you are part of that timeless flow. So close your eyes now. Sink deeper. Let the stories you've heard drift away on the breeze, like leaves carried to a quiet river. Tomorrow will wait. For now, you belong to the night. Good night.